The first thing he felt was heat, not warmth, not stuffiness, heat that pressed his face into the ground like a scorching palm. His cheek rested on something smooth and hot, not asphalt, not concrete, something else. He opened his eyes and saw white, white as far as the eye could see, white beneath him, white above him. The sky wasn't blue but faded, like an old bone. He tried to breathe, and his mouth filled with dry air that burned the inside of his throat. His mouth tasted of blood and something metallic, as if he were chewing on an old coin. Si-hyuk rolled onto his back, and the sun hit his eyes so hard that he immediately shut them again. He was lying on glass, not on sand, on glass, smooth, melted glass that stretched in every direction as far as the eye could see. He heard voices somewhere to his right. Strangers, an unfamiliar language, rough staccato sounds like barking. Then the clanking of chains, then footsteps, heavy boots stopped right by his head. Someone's hand grabbed him by the collar and yanked him to his knees. He saw a face. A dark, weather-beaten face with a scar running across his entire left cheek. The man said something to him. Si-hyuk didn't understand a word. The man spoke again, louder. Then he spat at his feet. A second pair of hands ripped something from his neck, a tag, a wooden tag on a string with some kind of markings. The man with the scar tossed the tag into the sand and turned away. Then there were camels, or something that looked like camels, a caravan of 6 animals loaded with bundles. The people climbed onto them and rode off. Without looking back, the dust from their departure settled within a minute, and Si-hyuk was left alone, on his knees in the middle of a white plain that hummed with heat like a scorching frying pan. He tried to stand up. His legs wouldn't obey him. He looked at his hands. Not his hands, thinner, younger, with calluses he'd never had, with nails broken down to the flesh. He touched his face. Not his face. His cheekbones were sharper. His nose was different. There was stubble he'd never had in his past life. Si-hyuk sat down on the glass and closed his eyes. His thoughts turned slowly, like stones in mud. He had died. That much he remembered. The bridge, the blow, darkness, and then the glass and the sun and someone else's boots. So he had died and ended up here, wherever this was. He opened his eyes again and looked around, slowly turning his head. A white plain, no trees, no rocks, no shadows, nothing but glass and the sky. And 3 steps away from him stood a door. Just a door. A heavy metal door with no wall behind it, no frame, no hinges attached to anything. It stood upright on the glass floor like a knife stuck in the ground, with an ordinary round handle. Si-hyuk stared at it for a minute. Then, too, the door didn't disappear. It was real. He could see the sun reflecting off the metal. He could see scratches on the surface. He could see a small dent at the bottom edge. It was a real door, and it stood in the middle of the desert without any wall behind it. He licked his chapped lips. His tongue was as dry as sandpaper. He was thirsty, very thirsty, truly thirsty. And this thought of water turned out to be the first clear thought he'd had since waking up. The dead don't want to drink. He knew that for sure. The dead don't feel their lips cracking. The dead don't feel the sun burning the back of their necks. So he wasn't dead. So all of this was real. The glass, the heat, the door. He stood up. His legs trembled but held him steady. He took a step, then a second, then a third. He reached out and grabbed the doorknob. The metal was hot but bearable. He gave it a tug. The door swung open toward him. Beyond it was a room. A small room, 3 by 3 meters, mud brick walls, a low ceiling. The floor was made of packed clay, and right in the center stood a stone well, not very deep, only up to his knees, filled with water. Si-hyuk saw the water, and his legs carried him forward of their own accord. He fell to his knees before the well and scooped up a handful with his palm. The water was cold, real, alive. He drank and couldn't stop. The water ran down his chin, down his neck, down his chest. He drank until his stomach ached. Then he sat down on the floor, leaning his back against the wall, and sat there motionless for a long time. He just breathed. A square of white light streamed in through the open door. Beyond the door lay the desert. Inside was shadow, coolness, water, 4 walls, the ceiling. He sat there staring at that square of light, and somewhere deep inside, amid the shock, thirst, and terror, a thought stirred within him, a strange one, an out-of-place one, utterly crazy for a man who had just nearly died of dehydration in the middle of a glass desert, 3 by 3, a well in the center. Where would he put the bed? Si-hyuk chuckled quietly. The laugh was hoarse and sounded more like a cough, but it was a laugh. 3 by 3 meters, 9 squares. The well takes up the central square. That means the usable area is 8 squares, minus the approach to the well, minus the door area. That leaves 5.5. The bed could only be placed in the far left corner if he slept diagonally. But then he'd bump into the well with his foot every time he got up. Bad layout. Very bad layout. He laughed again. Then he fell silent. Then he closed his eyes. The sun outside the door began to set. The light turned from white to yellow, then orange, then red. The shadows inside the room grew longer. The air grew cooler. Si-hyuk didn't move. He sat on the floor, leaning against the wall next to the stone well, in a room with no windows, no furniture, nothing, and he thought. Not about how he ended up here. Not about what had happened, not about whether he was alive or dead. He was thinking about how the wall opposite the door was perfectly oriented. If there were a window here, it would face west. The setting sun would shine right into his eyes, so it made sense that there was no window. That meant whoever built this knew what they were doing, or maybe they didn't know and just got lucky. Si-hyuk opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was smooth, no cracks, no marks. The clay was so tightly packed it looked as if it hadn't been smoothed by hand, but cast in a mold. He reached out and touched the wall. Warm, dry, smooth, not a single seam, not a single joint. The room was a single, solid structure, as if it hadn't been built, but grown. He stood up and walked around the perimeter of the room. 12 steps. The walls were of uniform thickness. The floor was level with no slope. The doorway was standard size, 2 meters by 80 centimeters. If he could even estimate centimeters by eye with this foreign body, he examined the well more closely. Stone, gray, roughly hewn stone, about 2 meters deep. The water was clear and odorless. Something was glowing at the bottom, dimly, barely noticeable. A greenish light. Si-hyuk stared at the glow for a long time, then decided he'd figure it out tomorrow, if tomorrow ever came. He returned to the wall where he'd been sitting and lay down on the floor. The clay was hard, but after the glass desert, it felt like a feather bed. He lay on his side, facing the well, and listened. Silence. Absolute silence. No wind, no insects, no distant voices, only his own breathing and the barely audible murmur of water in the well. He closed his eyes. His thoughts began to tangle. Images surfaced in fragments. Seoul, the office, a computer screen displaying a blueprint, the smell of coffee at 3 in the morning, the steering wheel, the headlights, darkness, and then glass, white glass. He didn't notice when he'd fallen asleep. The sleep was black and empty. No dreams, nothing, a void. And then he opened his eyes, and the first thing he saw was a wall. A new wall. He sat up with a start. His heart began to pound. The room had changed. No, the room was still the same. But an opening had appeared in the right-hand wall, an archway, only 1.5 meters high. Beyond it was another room. Si-hyuk stood up and walked over to the archway. He crouched down and peered inside. A second room, slightly smaller than the first, about 2.5 by 3 meters. In the far corner stood a stone hearth, small and rough, built of the same gray stone as the well. Above the hearth, in the ceiling, was a hole, a chimney. Si-hyuk stepped inside. He touched the hearth. It was cold, but there was a smell in the air. Ash, old ashes. as if this hearth had been used a long time ago, or as if it had simply appeared that way, already used, already lived in. He straightened up and looked at the archway leading back to the first room. Last night, that archway hadn't been there. He remembered that clearly. He walked around all the walls, smooth, solid, no archway, and now it was there, and beyond it, the kitchen. Si-hyuk sat down on the kitchen floor and remained motionless for a long time. Then he stood up, walked through the archway into the first room, drank some water from the well, went out through the door, and looked at the house from the outside. Yesterday, there had been nothing here but a doorway in the void. Now, beyond the door, he could make out the outline of a mud brick structure, small, low, as if it had grown out of the glass ground. 1 room yesterday, 2 today. He walked all the way around the structure. The walls on the outside were just as smooth as on the inside. No windows, no second door, just a ventilation hole above where the hearth should be. He went back inside and sat down by the well, so that's it. He's in someone else's body, in a strange world, in a desert of glass. He has a door that leads to the room with the well. Overnight, a kitchen had been added to the room, without his involvement. All on its own. He doesn't know the language. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know the rules of this world. He has no food, no tools, no weapons. He has only water and 2 rooms, and there's one more thing they didn't take from him. 20 years of experience. 20 years of blueprints. 20 years of thinking about how to cram a decent life into the smallest possible space. He stood up, walked over to the wall of the first room, and scratched a line into the clay with his fingernail, then a second. Then a third. An hour later, the wall bore a rough but legible plan of the 2 rooms, complete with dimensions and annotations, a well, a hearth, an arch, a door, ventilation. He took a step back and looked at his work. Crooked lines, uneven numbers, but it was a plan. His first plan in this world. He nodded to himself and went to drink some water. The day was just beginning. The third night brought a pantry. A small niche, 2 by 2 meters, appeared behind the kitchen. Inside stood 3 clay pots with lids. They were empty. Shelves made of stone ledges ran along one wall. Si-hyuk surveyed the pantry and first of all checked the joint between it and the kitchen. The arch was just as smooth as all the others. No traces of construction. No cracks. The room had simply appeared overnight and fitted into the existing structure so perfectly that it seemed as if it had always been there. He went outside and walked around the building. It had grown. 3 rooms. From the outside, it looked like a squat adobe outgrowth on a glass surface. Like a mushroom. Or a burrow. He went back inside and updated the diagram on the wall. The well, the kitchen, the pantry, the connections between them, the flow of movement. He drew a line from the door to the well, then from the well through the archway into the kitchen, then from the kitchen to the pantry. A route emerged, crooked and awkward. To fetch water and carry it to the hearth, one had to turn around in the narrow archway. The well stood in the center of the first room and blocked the passage. The door opened inward and took up half a meter of usable space. He stood in front of the wall for 3 hours, thinking. Then he erased half the plan and redrew it. If a 4th room appeared tomorrow, and if it appeared on the east side, it would be possible to move the sleeping area there. Then the first room would become a passageway, the central hub. The well would remain there, and that was right. The water source must be at the center of any living space. He'd known that since his freshman year. The 4th night brought the bedroom. It appeared on the east side, just as he'd expected. 3 by 2.5 meters, a low ceiling, a stone platform in the corner, not a bed, but a platform on which one could lie down. Hard, but it was off the floor, which meant it was warmer at night and farther from insects, if any were around. Si-hyuk lay down on the platform and, for the first time in 4 nights, slept on something other than bare clay. His back thanked him in the morning. He revised his plan. 4 rooms, a well in the central one, a kitchen with a hearth on the left, a pantry behind the kitchen, the bedroom on the right, a door leading outside directly opposite the bedroom entrance. The flow of movement became clearer. He woke up. He stepped out of the bedroom. He walked through the central room. He drew some water. He carried it to the kitchen. He returned. He lay down. 3 main routes. None of them crossed. For 4 rooms it was almost perfect, almost, because there was still no bathroom. He relieved himself outside behind the building, and every time he thought that if other people showed up here, this problem would have to be solved first, not second, not third, first, the 5th night. He went to bed in the bedroom and discovered in the morning that a workshop had been added to the building, a large one, the largest room of them all, 4 by 4 meters, no windows, no ventilation, a box with high ceilings. The floor wasn't clay but stone, smooth, polished, dark stone. At chest height there were stone ledges running along the walls, shelves or workbenches. He wasn't sure. 5 rooms. Sihaikok stood in the middle of the workshop and counted. If one room appeared every night, there would be 30 in a month, 60 in 2 months, 365 in a year. The numbers swirled in his head. He didn't know why the house was growing. He didn't know by what rules. He didn't know what would happen when there were 100 or 200 or 1,000 rooms, but he knew one thing. If the space was growing, he needed to plan for it. Now. From day one. From the first line on the wall, because later it would be too late. He'd seen it happen on Earth dozens of times. A neighborhood built without a plan turned into a maze within 2 years. People added extensions haphazardly. They blocked off passageways. They boarded up windows. And 5 years later, it was impossible to drive through, walk through, or run a pipe through that neighborhood. He wouldn't let that happen here. He sat down on the stone floor of the workshop and scratched the first master plan onto the wall with his fingernail. Not a floor plan, a plan for the future. If the house continued to grow, it would need an axis, a main corridor through which all routes would pass. The well had to remain in the center, but a second access point needed to be built leading to it. The kitchen had to be next to the pantry. The sleeping quarters had to be farther from the entrance. The workshop could become anything, a storage room, a smokehouse, or a workshop. It all depended on what was needed. But one thing he had decided firmly, this room would have no windows and no ventilation. If he channeled smoke from the kitchen hearth into it, it would become a smokehouse if he could find something to smoke with, and if he could find something to smoke. He stood by the wall, looking at his plan, when a sound came from outside. He froze. He listened. The sound repeated, a scraping noise, as if something heavy were being dragged across the glass. Then silence, then a faint, raspy sound, not a scream, not a moan, something in between. Si-hyuk left the workshop, walked through the kitchen and the central room, and stopped at the door. He cracked it open. The light hit his eyes. When he blinked, he saw her. A person was lying on the glass, 20 paces from the door. No, a woman. She was lying on her side, curled up. With one hand she was clutching something to her chest. A bundle. A small hand was sticking out of the bundle. A child's. Si-hyuk ran outside. The glass burned his bare feet, but he didn't stop. He reached her in 10 seconds. He fell to his knees beside her. The woman was emaciated. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her skin was gray. Her eyes were cloudy and half open. She was looking at him but didn't see him. The child looked no older than a year. He wasn't crying. He wasn't moving. He just lay there with his eyes closed, dehydrated. Si-hyuk grabbed the woman by the arms and dragged her toward the door. She was light, too light. Her bones beneath the fabric were like sticks. He dragged her inside. He laid her down by the well. He scooped up some water with his palm and brought it to her lips. She didn't drink. The water ran down her chin. He tried again, more slowly, drop by drop. Her lips twitched. She swallowed. Once more. More. Then he turned his attention to the child. He wet the hem of his shirt and squeezed it into the child's mouth. A drop. Another. The child swallowed and moved his hand weakly. Alive. Si-hyuk sat down on the floor next to them and exhaled. His hands were shaking, not from the effort, from something else. He looked at the woman, then at the child, then at his 5 rooms, 3 by 3, 2.5 by 3, 2 by 2, 3 by 2.5, 4 by 4, Total area about 35 square meters. One well, one hearth, one chimney, not a single bathroom. And now there were two people who would die if he didn't turn these 35 meters into something suitable for the three of them to live in. He stood up and walked over to the wall where the plan was sketched. He looked at it. Then he picked up a shard of stone he'd found yesterday near the building. And he began to erase the lines. All the lines. He'll redraw everything from scratch, right now. The well should be against the wall, not in the center. If he moves it, no. The well can't be moved, it's made of stone. But he can change everything else around it. He can repurpose the rooms. The storage room will be divided in half. One half will remain a storage room. The other half becomes a nook for a mother and child. A curtain made from his shirt will separate the nook from the rest of the space. The mother must be able to see the entrance. This is important. A traumatized person must always be able to see the way out of a room. He knew this not from architecture but from the psychology of space. A social worker in Seoul taught him this when they were designing a women's shelter. The kitchen hearth needs to be reoriented. If the smoke goes not upward but toward the workshop through a hole in the wall, the workshop will become a smokehouse. The draft will be poor, but it will work. At the same time, the smoke will heat the workshop at night, and if the child is placed there for the night, he'll be warmer. No, smoke is harmful to a child. So heat the wall with smoke and put the child on the other side of the wall. The heat will pass through the clay. Clay is a good heat conductor, slow but steady. A Korean in the 21st century knows this because he grew up in a country where homes have been heated this way for 1,000 years. Through the floor, through the walls, ondal. He scribbled a new diagram on the wall. Smoke from the hearth travels through a hole in the workshop wall. It travels along the floor. It exits through the chimney in the ceiling. Along the way, it heats the stone floor of the workshop and the adjacent wall. On the other side of that wall is the pantry. It's warm and dry there. His mother and child were there. He worked for 3 hours. With a knife he found tucked into the folds of his clothes, he cut a hole in the wall between the kitchen and the workshop. A small one, about 2 fists wide, just big enough for the smoke to pass through. Then he tore his shirt and hung half of it in the pantry, partitioning off a corner. Then he gathered all the shards of glass he found outside the building and arranged them in the workshop to form a shallow bowl. The glass would cool overnight. The warm, moist air from the chimney would touch the cold glass and condense. 2 spoonfuls of water overnight, maybe 3. Nothing for an adult. For a baby, it's the difference between life and death. By the time he finished, the sun was already setting. The woman had regained consciousness by evening. She was lying in the corner of the storeroom on the floor, which was covered with the other half of his shirt. The baby was sleeping on her chest. She was looking at Se-hyuk, who was sitting by the well and drawing a plan on the wall. She said something, quietly, hoarsely. Se-hyuk didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was asking. She didn't believe it. She didn't understand where she had ended up. He turned toward her and did the only thing he could. He scooped up some water in his palm and held it out to her. She drank. Then she said something else, this time more slowly, and Se-hyuk suddenly understood. Not the words, not the language, but the meaning. It was as if something clicked in his head and the unfamiliar sounds took on meaning. She said that he had built her a house in an hour. Se-hyuk wiped his hands on his pants, the only piece of clothing he had left that was still intact, and he replied. He didn't know if he was speaking her language or Korean or something else entirely, but she understood. He said he hadn't built a house. He said he'd simply rearranged what was already there so that she'd be comfortable. He told her to sleep. He said that tomorrow there would be another room, and that he'd give it to her. The woman began to cry, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her gray face, leaving pale trails. Se-hyuk turned away. He went into the kitchen. He sat down on the floor. He leaned against the wall next to the hearth, which had no fire because he had nothing to light it with, and for the first time in 5 days, he allowed himself to think. He's alive. It seems he's alive after all. And tomorrow he'll have 6 rooms, and a woman and a child to feed, and not a single spoonful of food, and not a single tool except a dull knife. And a plan on the wall that looks like madness, but it's a plan. And he knows how to work with plans. It's the only thing he knows how to do. And maybe that will be enough. It was the morning of the 6th day. A new room had appeared between the workshop and the bedroom. It was narrow, 1.5 by 3 meters. There was a recess in the floor, a small one, about the size of a basin. Se-hyuk stood over it, looking down. At the bottom of the recess lay a thin layer of sand, not glass sand, but ordinary yellow sand. The sand was damp. He touched the walls. In one wall, at waist level, there was an opening, a horizontal channel leading somewhere into the thickness of the wall. He bent down and peered inside. Darkness. But there was a draft coming from there, faint, barely perceptible. The air was moving. So the channel must lead somewhere. A bathroom. The house had given him a bathroom. Se-hyuk sat down on the floor and just sat there for a minute. Then he stood up and went to update his floor plan. 6 rooms, a well, a kitchen, a pantry, a bedroom, a workshop, a bathroom. The total area was approximately 42 square meters. For 3 people, that's 14 square meters per person. In Seoul, for his last project, he had allocated at least 28 square meters per person. 14 was the bare minimum. But even the bare minimum is still a standard. People live in even smaller spaces. He had seen refugee camps where each person had only 3.5 square meters of space, and people lived there. It's not about the square meters, it's about how those square meters are organized. He went back to the bathroom and worked for 3 hours. He used a knife to widen the indentation in the floor. The sand at the bottom turned out to be a filter. The water he poured on top seeped through the sand and drained into a channel in the wall. He checked it. He poured a handful of water. He waited. The water drained away. He poured some more. It drained away. A primitive but working system, a sand filter, a drainage channel. He didn't know where the channel led the water. Maybe outside. Maybe into some kind of reservoir under the house. But the system worked, and that was more important than the answers. Mei-hee woke up just as he was finishing. She came out of the pantry with the child in her arms and stopped in the archway. She watched as he knelt, smoothing out the edge of the recess. Se-hyuk showed her. He explained as best he could, partly with words, partly with gestures. She listened intently. Then she nodded and said a single word. He took it as gratitude, or perhaps surprise, or perhaps both. The language came to him strangely, not like learning it, more like remembering it. As if he had once known these words, and now they were surfacing one by one from the depths. With every passing hour, he understood a little more. With every passing hour, he could say a little more. By noon, they were sitting by the well, and Mei-hee was telling her story. Slowly, in simple words, choosing the ones he could understand. She told him she had been in a caravan, a large caravan from Hajin to the southern oases, 50 people, 20 wagons. They were traveling along the edge of the desert. At night, a storm began. Not a sandstorm, a glass storm. Tiny shards of glass flew horizontally, cutting through everything in their path. The caravan scattered within an hour. She ran with her child. She ran for 3 days. Then she crawled. Then she saw a door. Se-hyuk listened and memorized everything. Hajin, the southern oases, caravans, glass storms. He asked a question, just one, a simple one. What is the glass desert? Mei-hee looked at him. He saw something flash in her eyes. Not surprise, suspicion. What adult doesn't know what the glass desert is? But she answered, 200 years ago there was an empire here, a great one, a mighty one. The people there knew how to build houses that breathed, roads that remembered travelers, towers that cooled the air. Then the mage architects tried to build a city that would become a living being, and everything fell apart. Overnight, the empire vanished. The earth melted into glass. Only the desert remained, and the ruins, breathing stones, fragments of that architecture that still functioned to this day. filtering water, cooling the air, repairing cracks on their own. A single such stone is worth more than a caravan of silk. Sihayuk listened and looked at the walls around him, at the smooth clay without a single seam, at the well with its glowing bottom, at the arches that had appeared overnight. At the perfect joints between the rooms, he asked one more question. The desert had stopped. Mei-He shook her head. The desert is creeping forward. 3 kilometers a year, it devours villages, oases, caravan routes. No one knows why. The principalities are fighting over the remaining land, for water, for salt veins, for breathing stones. He nodded. He looked at the well. The water in it was cold and clear. At the bottom, everything still glowed greenish. This well, these walls, this door, all of this was part of that ancient architecture. He lived inside a fragment of the First Empire, and the ruin was growing. Every night. Mei-He had gone to feed the baby. Sihayuk stayed by the well. He was thinking. Not about the past, not about how he'd ended up here. He was thinking about the sewage system. An outhouse with a sand filter was a temporary solution. If more people showed up, and for some reason he had no doubt they would, if more people showed up, one outhouse wouldn't be enough. He needed a system, a centralized drainage system, a slope, ventilation, separate outhouses for men and women. The water intake point must be higher than the drainage point. That's a basic sanitation standard. The well in the center, the outhouses on the periphery, drainage flowing from the center to the edges. He knew all this by heart. He'd designed it dozens of times, on paper, on a screen, in software. Now he had to sketch it out with his fingernail on a clay wall, without a tape measure, without a level, without a calculator. He began to sketch a general drainage plan for a future settlement of up to 100 residents, the main sewer line, side branches, a 2% slope, inspection chambers every 30 meters, sand filters at the inlet of each riser. He drew until sunset. When the light began to fade, he went into the workshop, where a glass condenser had collected a puddle of water overnight. 2 spoonfuls. He took them to Mei-Shi for her child. She took them and looked at him, as if he'd brought her gold. They were 2 spoonfuls of water. To him they were worth an hour's work, and calculating the angle of the glass shards. To her they were worth her son's life. That night he lay down in the bedroom and thought before falling asleep. The 7th day. 7 days ago he was dead, or he was alive in another world, or he was someone else. Now he had 6 rooms, a woman with a child, a sewer map on the wall, and not a single answer to the question of why all this. He fell asleep and for the first time had a dream. He was standing in front of a monitor in his sole office. On the screen was a plan of the resettlement district, that very same unfinished project, a laundry room on the 1st floor. He still hadn't decided where to put it. In his dream, he turned and saw not Seoul outside the window, but a white desert, and in the middle of the desert stood his door. He woke up drenched in sweat. Morning. The 7th day, a new room. It had appeared above the kitchen, not next to it, above it. The 2nd floor. Small. More like an attic, 1.5 meters high. A step carved directly into the wall led up there. Sihayuk climbed up and lay on his stomach because it was impossible to stand. An attic, 3 by 3 meters. There was a hole in the floor through which warm air rose from the hearth. It would be the warmest place here in winter. This would be the best place to sleep. He climbed back down and revised his plan. For the first time, he had to draw not a floor plan, but a cross-section. A side view. 1st floor, 2nd floor, the connection between them, vertical access. Back on the ground, he'd solved this problem every day. Elevators, stairs, ramps. Here, he had a single step in the wall, just one, no railing, but it was a start. He was standing in front of the wall with his floor plan and cross-section drawing when he heard Mei-He's voice. She was calling him. Quickly, anxiously, he went outside. Mei-He was standing by the door, pointing toward the horizon. There, far away, at the very edge of the white plain, points were moving. 1, 2, 3. 3 figures were walking toward the door. Slowly, unevenly. That's how people walk who have long since lost their strength and keep going only because they can't stop. Si-hyuk looked at Mei-hee. She was holding the child close to her chest, and her face was ashen, not from fear, from memory. She had walked toward that same door a week ago. Si-hyuk looked at the figures, then at the door, then at his 7-room house, then back at the figures. 3 people. 3. He had 35 square meters on the first floor and 9 in the attic. That made 44 square meters total. For 6 people, that's a little over 7 square meters per person, below the minimum standard, but livable. He went to meet them. On the 6th day, a bathroom with a sand filter and a drainage channel appeared. Mei-hee told Si-hyuk about the glass desert and the fall of the First Empire. He realized he was living inside the ruins of ancient architecture. He sketched out a general layout for a sewage system designed for 100 residents. On the 7th day, the 2nd floor appeared. By evening, 3 new people appeared on the horizon, walking toward the door. The 3 turned out to be a man and 2 teenagers. The man was in his 50s. His face was dark and furrowed with wrinkles. His hands were like the roots of an old tree. Broad shoulders were visible beneath his tattered raincoat. He walked in front, and when he reached the door, he stopped and stared at it for a long time. Then at Si-hyuk. Then at the door again. The teenagers stood behind him, a boy and a girl, about 13 or 14 years old, skinny as sticks and sunburnt. The boy was holding on to the man's shoulder. The girl stood apart, slightly to the side, and looked at the house, not at Si-hyuk, but at the house. The man spoke. His voice was low and hoarse. He spoke the same language as Mei-hee, but with a different accent, sharper, more choppy. He introduced himself, Old Nam, a caravan driver. For 30 years, he'd led caravans across the edge of the desert. He knew every oasis from Hajin to the southern foothills. He'd found the teenagers 2 days ago, a brother and sister. From a village the desert had swallowed up a month ago. They were walking together. Without water, without food, without direction. He'd picked them up only because he'd heard the boy's voice. The boy was singing. In the middle of the glassy plain under the scorching sun, this boy was singing. Old Nam said that after that he had no choice left. Si-hyuk led them inside. Water, shade, a floor. He proceeded step by step. First, the well. Drink. Slowly. Little by little. A dehydrated person mustn't drink too much at once. He knew this not from architecture, but from a first aid course he'd taken 5 years ago at work. Then food. There was no food. A problem. Then rest. The attic above the kitchen. Warm, quiet. He laid the teenagers down, upstairs. The boy fell asleep within a minute. The girl lay there with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Si-hyuk left her be. Old Nam sat by the well and drank water in small sips. Between sips he spoke. Slowly, thoughtfully. He looked at the walls, at the arches, at the blueprint sketched on the wall. And Si-hyuk could see that this man understood more than he was saying. Old Nam asked how long he'd been here. Si-hyuk replied, 7 days. Old Nam looked at the 7 rooms and the plan on the wall and said nothing. Then he asked how he knew how to build. Si-hyuk said he was an architect. Old Nam snorted. He said he'd seen architects in Hajin at the guild. They wear white robes and draw on silk scrolls. They don't lie on the floor with a knife or scratch at the walls. Si-hyuk said he was a different kind of architect. Old Nam snorted again. Then he said something that made Si-hyuk freeze. He said rumors about a door in the desert had been circulating for 3 days now. A caravan driver on the southern route had seen the glint of metal in the sun. He told the people at the camp. The camp told the oasis. The oasis told the caravan. Old Nam heard about it yesterday morning at the small oasis of Ren. A 2-day journey from here. He went to check it out because in 30 years in the desert, he'd learned one thing. Rumors that sound crazy usually turn out to be true. Ordinary rumors don't spread. Crazy ones spread in a matter of hours. Si-hyuk listened and counted. 3 days. Rumors take 3 days to spread. If one oasis has heard about the door, everyone will know in a week. And if everyone found out, it wouldn't just be refugees who'd come. Merchants would come. The curious would come. Those who'd be better off not coming would come. He looked at the map on the wall. 7 rooms, 6 people, and rumors spreading like a crack in glass. He walked over to the wall and drew a new line. Not inside the map, around it, a perimeter, the boundary of the future settlement. Inside, everything that's there. Outside, everything that's coming. Between them, a wall or a moat or something to mark the line. Not for defense, for order. Old Nam looked at him, then he stood up, walked over, and looked at the plan. For a long time, intently. Then he poked his finger at one line and asked what it was. Si Hyok said it was the future sewer, a drain to carry away dirty water. Old Nam looked at him as if he'd just spoken in the language of the dead. Then he said that in 30 years of caravan life, he'd seen 200 settlements. Not a single one of them had a drainage system for wastewater. People simply poured everything out onto the street. Si Hyok said that was why people got sick. Old Nam was silent for a second. Then he nodded. Slowly, heavily, like a man who had just realized something that would have changed his entire life had he known it sooner. They talked until evening. Old Nam knew everything. Trade routes, the names of the principalities, distances, prices, dangers. Si Hyok listened and memorized. 4 principalities surrounding the desert. Heijin in the north, the most powerful, with an architect's guild that controls all the breathing stones. Murak in the east, a trading principality, rich, greedy. Sil in the south, poor, desperate. Tanra in the west, isolated, strange. Few know much about it. Between the principalities lie the caravan routes. Along the edge of the desert, through the oases. Each oasis is a stop. Water, trade, sometimes a fight. There are no doors in the desert. A door is impossible. Old Nam said so outright. He said that metal doesn't last in the desert. Metal melts, glass melts, stone cracks. Nothing survives on the glass plain, but this door stands, and behind it water and walls, and a man drawing plans for drainage channels. He said that either Si Hyok was a saint or a madman or both. Si Hyok replied that he was simply an architect who wanted a drink. Old Nam laughed. It was the first laugh Si Hyok had heard in this world, dry and short, like a cough, but a laugh nonetheless. That night, Si Hyok went to bed in the bedroom. He had the teenagers settle in the attic. Mei and the child were in the pantry. Old Nam lay down on the stone floor of the workshop and said he'd slept through worse. Before going to sleep, Si Hyok went around all the rooms. He checked them. Water in the well, the condenser in the workshop, drainage in the bathroom, smoke from the hearth if a fire were burning there. There was no fire, nothing to light it with. No fuel, no food. 2 resources they lacked, and without which 6 people wouldn't survive more than 3 days. He lay in the darkness and thought, there is water, there is shelter. Sanitation is primitive, but it exists. There is no food, there is no fuel, there are no materials for tools. He weighed his options. In the glass desert, there are no plants, there are no animals, there is nothing edible. But Mei came from the direction of the caravan. Old Nam had come from the Ren oasis. A 2-day journey. That meant there was a place 2 days' journey away where there was food, or at least a market. He needed something to trade. He had nothing except water. Water. In a world where the desert devours the land and the caravan routes dry up every year, water from a well that never runs dry, water that's always there. It's not just a resource, it's currency. He fell asleep with that thought. In the morning, the 8th room appeared. It was strange. Not made of clay. The walls were of the same dark stone as the workshop floor, small, 2 by 2. In the center stood a stone block, flat, at waist level, like a workbench or an altar. There were grooves on the block's surface, thin, geometric, straight lines intersecting at right angles. A grid, Hyuk ran his finger along the grooves. They were deep, precise, perfectly even. This wasn't an ornament, it was a coordinate grid, a drafting table. The house had given him a drafting table. He stood before it, his hands trembling, not from hunger, not from the cold, from recognition. He knew this table, not this specific one, but this type. A coordinate grid, a scale ruler carved into the stone along the edge, grooves for securing a sheet of paper. Back home, it was a drafting table, a drafting machine. They'd given him a tool, not a knife, not a hammer, not a weapon, a drafting table. He went out to join the others. Mei-he was preparing something by the hearth. Old Nam brought fire. From somewhere in the folds of his cloak, he pulled out a flint and dry tinder. Fire in the hearth. The first fire in 8 days. There wasn't much smoke. The draft through the hole in the workshop wall was working. Not perfectly, but it was working. The workshop was warming up. The wall between it and the storeroom was radiating heat. In the storeroom, where Mei-he was sleeping with the child, it was warmer than yesterday. The ondal was working. In another world. In another body. Through a hole in the wall cut with a dull knife. But it worked. Old Nam was cooking something in a pot from the storeroom, some dried roots he'd brought with him. It smelled bitter and earthy. A thin soup, their first meal. They ate in silence. All 6 of them. Around the hearth. The bitter liquid burned his mouth, but Hyuk drank it, and it seemed to him that he had never tasted anything more delicious in his life. Neither in this one nor in the last. After the meal, old Nam looked at him and said that the roots would last for 2 days, then they would need food, real food. He said he could reach the Ren oasis in 2 days, but he had nothing to offer in exchange. Hyuk nodded. He'd already thought about that. He said they had water. Old Nam raised an eyebrow. You can't carry water across the desert, it'll evaporate along the way. They'd need water skins, jugs, flasks. They had none of those. Hyuk looked at the clay pots in the storeroom. 3 pots with lids. He picked one up, examined it. The clay was dense, fired, the lid fit snugly. Not airtight, but snug. He said the pot could be wrapped in cloth and the edges sealed with clay paste. It would make a makeshift travel jug. Not perfect, but it would last for 2 days. Old Nam looked at him, then at the pot, then back at him. Then he said he needed a second pot, one with water for the journey, one with water for the market. Water from the well that stands in the middle of the glass desert, water that doesn't exist. It's a commodity, the best commodity he'd seen in 30 years. Hyuk gave him 2 pots. He kept the third for home. Mei-he tore the hem of her dress, and they wrapped the pots in the fabric. Hyuk mixed the clay for sealing from dust on the floor, blending it with water. Primitive, rough, but it worked. Old Nam left at dawn on the 9th day, with 2 pots of water, with a promise to return in 4 days, with food, with news, with answers to questions of which Hyuk had more than he had rooms. Hyuk stood at the door and watched as the caravan driver's figure grew smaller on the white plain. Mei-he stood nearby. The child in her arms was asleep. The teenage girl came out of the house and stood beside them, silently. She didn't speak at all. For 2 days, Hyuk hadn't heard a single word from her. The boy did the talking for both of them. A lot, quickly, about everything. The girl remained silent, but she watched. Everything, everyone, and especially the blueprints on the walls. Hyuk had noticed this yesterday. She stood in front of the sewer plan and traced the lines with her finger, not absent-mindedly. She was following the logic, the direction of the flow, the gradients. A 14-year-old girl from a village, swallowed up by the desert, stood in front of the sewer blueprint and studied it. He didn't say anything to her. He just took note. Old Nam, the caravan driver, and 2 teenagers, a brother and sister from the destroyed village, arrived. Nam brought fire and told them about the 4 principalities and how rumors about the door were already spreading. On the 8th day, the house provided a drafting table with a coordinate grid. Nam left for the Ren oasis with 2 pots of water to trade. The teenage girl silently began to study the blueprints on the walls. The 9th day without old Nam, the 10th, the 11th, a new room every morning. The 9th turned out to be a long, narrow hallway that connected the bedroom directly to the workshop. For the first time, Si-hyuk was able to walk from one end of the house to the other without passing through the central room with the well. That was important, not because it saved 10 steps, but because it created a second route. In any building, there must be at least 2 paths from point A to point B. That's a fire safety rule. That's a rule of logistics. That's a rule of common sense. The 10th room appeared next to the bathroom. Small, very small, 1 meter by 1 meter. A stone floor sloping toward the center. In the center, an opening, a drain. Above the hole in the floor, a second hole in the ceiling. Ventilation. Si-hyuk stood in this tiny room and looked at the sloping floor. He knew what it was, a shower, or the beginnings of one. If water were supplied from above, it would flow toward the center and drain away. Supply water from above, that would require pressure, or a bucket. For now, a bucket. But he made a mental note. Someday there would be running water here. The 11th room puzzled him. It wasn't on the first floor or in the attic. It appeared outside, an addition, open on one side, a shelter with 3 walls and a stone floor, a roof, a shadow, but not an enclosed room, a veranda. He stood under the canopy and looked out at the desert. From here, he could see the horizon, a white line, endless, dead. He thought that this veranda was the first place in the house from which one could look outside without stepping out from under the roof, a transitional space between the inside and the outside, between safety and the unknown. In architecture, this is called a buffer zone, a threshold that is neither inside nor outside. He loved such spaces, on the ground. He included them in every project, covered galleries on the first floors, loggias, front gardens, places where a person can pause between the house and the street and breathe. Here, it was a stone veranda in the middle of a glass desert. But the function was the same. Mei-hee was the first to appreciate the veranda. She carried the baby out and laid him on a stone in the shade. The baby lay there, looking up at the sky. For the first time since the day they arrived, he was out in the open but in the shade. Mei-hee sat down beside him, and for the first time in all those days, Si-hyuk saw her shoulders relax. Not completely, but just a little, enough to notice. Si-hyuk was working. Every day, from dawn till dusk, he was drawing the master plan on the drafting table in room 8. Not with a scraper on the wall, on stone, in the grooves of the coordinate grid. With a sharp shard of glass, he scratched out the lines, thin, precise. The plan was a far cry from a computer-generated drawing, but for this world that was impossible. He was drawing up the master plan for a settlement of 50 rooms, with some leeway, the central axis, the well, the square, 2 residential wings, the utility block, the restroom and shower area on the periphery, the kitchen dining room, storage rooms, all routes measured in steps, all drains directed from the center to the edges, all bedrooms oriented away from the sun. The girl came on the 3rd day. She entered the drafting room silently. She stood behind him. She watched him work. Si-hyuk sensed her gaze but didn't turn around. She stood there for an hour. Then she left. On the 4th day, she came back. She stood there for 2 hours. On the 5th day, Si-hyuk placed a shard of glass and a small piece of clay on the stone surface next to him. He didn't say a word. He just set them down. The girl stood there. She looked at the shard, at the clay, at him. Then she stepped forward. She picked up the shard. She picked up the clay. She walked over to the wall and began to draw a curved line, then a straight line, then a square. Then, inside the square, another smaller square, and a small circle in the corner. Si-hyuk looked. A square inside it, a circle in the corner, a room, a bed, a window. She had drawn a room, her room, the one she'd never had. He stood there looking at that crooked drawing, and something inside him tightened. Not in his throat, deeper. In that place he'd long thought had scarred over, A 14-year-old orphan had drawn the room she wanted to live in, with a bed, with a window. Si-hyuk walked over to the wall. He took out his shard, and next to her sketch, he drew the same square, but with dimensions, with a door, with the window's orientation marked, with a note on the ceiling height. He turned her dream into a technical drawing. The girl watched. Then she looked at him, and for the first time in all the days she'd spent here, something appeared on her face. Not a smile, a flicker, a shadow of something that would one day become a smile. The boy was changing, too. He wasn't interested in the drawings. He was interested in everything else. He scoured every room. He checked every corner. He found a crack in the workshop wall that Si-hyuk didn't know about. He discovered that the capacitor made of glass shards worked better if moved closer to the chimney. He discovered that the water in the well was colder in the morning and warmer in the evening. He would come to Si-hyuk and report everything, loudly, in detail, waving his arms about. Si-hyuk listened and nodded, thinking each time that this boy would make an excellent foreman, if he survived. Old Nam returned on the 12th day, late in the evening, when the sun had already set and the desert had turned from white to gray. He didn't come alone. A donkey followed behind him, a small, skinny, stubborn donkey loaded with 2 sacks. Mei-he ran out onto the porch. The boy shouted and ran to meet him. The girl remained standing by the door. Old Nam reached the porch, set down the sacks, and sat down on a rock. It was hard. He was exhausted. 4 days across the glassy desert, there and back. For a 50-year-old man, that's a feat. He didn't say that. He said he'd brought grain, dried meat, salt, rope, cloth, 2 real clay jugs with stoppers, and news. He spoke slowly between sips of water. The water he'd brought in the jugs made an impression. The merchant at the Ren Oasis tasted it and fell silent for a moment. Then he tasted it again. Then he asked where it came from. Old Nam said it was from a well in the desert. The merchant didn't believe him. Nam offered him a second serving for free. The merchant drank it. He fell silent for another minute. Then he gave Nam everything he asked for in exchange for the remaining water in the pot, grain, meat, salt, and a donkey to boot. For a pot of water. Si-hyuk listened and wasn't surprised. He already understood. The water from the well wasn't just water. It was pure. Truly pure, filtered by that greenish glow at the bottom. In a world where water from oases is often murky, brackish, and frequently contaminated, this water was a miracle. Not a magical miracle, a technological one. The ancient filtration system of the First Empire was still working 200 years later, and Si-hyuk was sitting right on top of it. But Old Nam hadn't just brought goods. He'd brought a warning. At the Ren Oasis, he'd overheard some conversations. People already knew about the door in the desert. Not just the nearby nomads. Merchants from the northern route had mentioned it. A caravan leader from Heijin was asking questions. And, most importantly, at the Ren Oasis, there were 3 men in gray cloaks. They weren't trading. They weren't buying. They were listening. They sat in the shadows and listened to every conversation. Old Nam recognized this type. Guild members, scouts from the Hajin Architects Guild. They search for any traces of ancient architecture, any at all, and they destroy them, along with those who found them. Si-hyuk listened to this and remained silent for a long time. Then he asked how much time they had. Old Nam shrugged. A week, maybe 2. The guild members aren't in a hurry. They check, double-check, gather information, but when they come with a decision. A week, maybe 2. He had 11 rooms and 6 people, including a baby and 2 teenagers, against the guild, which destroys everything that reminds them of the First Empire. He stood up and walked over to the drafting table. Mei-he was handing out food. The boy was feeding the donkey. The girl was standing by the wall, looking at her drawing of the room. Old Nam was sitting on the veranda, gazing out at the desert. Si-hyuk sat down at the stone table and placed his palms on the grid, the cold stone beneath his fingers, the grooves of the grid, the lines, the angles, the scale. He closed his eyes and saw the plan, not the one on the wall, another one, a bigger one. He saw how 11 rooms would become 20, how 20 would become 50, how a wall would appear. A courtyard, a gate, not a fortress, not a prison, a home. A big home, one you can enter and leave, but one you don't want to leave. He opened his eyes, picked up a shard of glass, and began to sketch. The master plan for the settlement of Munja, the threshold, the place between the desert and life. The first line was drawn on the stone smoothly and confidently, as if his hand knew where to go before his mind had even decided. He drew until dawn. When the sun rose over the desert and the first ray fell on the stone table, Si-hyuk stepped back and looked at his work. On the stone was a plan, a real master plan, with a central square around a well, with 2 residential wings radiating from the center, with a utility zone along the edge, with 2 gates, the eastern and western ones, with a drainage line, with the location of the future market marked, with a spot for a school, with a mark indicating where the library would be, with arrows indicating wind direction, with marks showing the sun's altitude at different times of day, with a shaded area, with a spot for well number 2, which would appear once the house had grown large enough, with a small square in the north wing next to which stood a note, Yuna's room, with a window. Mei-he brought him water. He drank and looked at the plan. There were over 200 rooms on this drawing. He had 11, maybe 12 by morning if the house continued to grow, 12 out of 200. But the plan was ready, and every subsequent room would fit into it like a part in a mechanism, not chaotically, not randomly, according to plan. He finished his water and stepped out onto the veranda. Morning, the 12th day in this world. Somewhere 2 days' walk away, 3 people in gray cloaks were asking questions about a door in the desert, and he stood on the stone porch thinking about how he'd forgotten to mark a spot for the communal laundry room on the blueprint. Si-hyuk walked toward the 3 figures, counting his steps, 40, 50, 60. The glass beneath his bare feet was hot but bearable. The sun hung low and beat down on his back. His shadow stretched far ahead. A long, thin shadow cast by a stranger's body. The figures were drawing closer. A man led the way, broad-shouldered, not very tall. With every step, Si-hyuk could see him more clearly, a dark face etched with wrinkles, hands like roots, a tattered cloak draped over his shoulders. Behind him were 2 others, teenagers, a boy and a girl. The boy was holding onto the man's shoulder. The girl walked separately, at a distance, as if she weren't with them but beside them. The man stopped 10 paces away. He looked at Si-hyuk, then at the door behind him, then back at Si-hyuk. He introduced himself, Old Nam, a caravan driver. His voice was low and hoarse. His accent was different from Mei-he's, more choppy, drier, like the desert itself. Si-hyuk nodded and gestured toward the door. Water, shade, floor. 3 words he repeated to everyone who came. 3 words that were worth more than gold here. He led them inside. The teenagers drank greedily, and Si-hyuk stopped them. Slowly, little by little. A dehydrated person shouldn't drink in one gulp. The stomach can't handle it. He knew this not from architecture, but from a first aid course he'd taken at work 5 years ago. Back then, he'd thought the course was a waste of a Saturday. Now, that course was saving lives. The boy obeyed right away. The girl gave him a long look and stopped drinking as well. Si-hyuk settled the teenagers in the attic above the kitchen. Warm air from the hearth rose through a hole in the floor. The boy fell asleep within a minute. The girl lay down and closed her eyes, but Si-hyuk could tell she wasn't asleep. By her breathing, too steady, too controlled. That's how someone breathes who's pretending to be asleep because they don't trust the place where they're lying. He left her alone. He didn't touch her, he didn't speak. He just walked away. Downstairs, Old Nam sat by the well and drank water in small sips. Between sips, he spoke, slowly, appraisingly. His eyes roamed over the walls, over the arches, over the plan sketched on clay. He asked how long Si-hyuk had been here. 7 days. Name looked at the 7 rooms and the blueprints and remained silent. It was an eloquent silence, the silence of a man who sees the impossible and is trying to decide whether to believe it or not. Then he asked how Si-hyuk knew how to build. Si-hyuk said he was an architect. Nam snorted. He said he'd seen architects in Haejin. They wear white robes and draw on silk scrolls. They don't lie on the floor with a knife or scratch at the walls. Si-hyuk replied that he was a different kind of architect. Nam snorted again. Then he said something that made Si-hyuk freeze. Rumors about the door were already spreading. 3 days. A caravan driver on the southern route had seen the glint of metal in the sun. He told the people at the camp told the oasis told the caravan. Nam heard about it yesterday morning at the small oasis of Ren, a 2-day trek. He went to check it out because in 30 years in the desert he'd learned one thing. Rumors that sound crazy are usually true. Ordinary rumors don't spread. Crazy ones spread in a matter of hours. Si-hyuk listened and did the math. If one oasis found out about the door, everyone would know within a week. And if everyone knew, it wouldn't just be refugees who'd come. Merchants would come, the curious, those who'd be better off not coming. He walked over to the wall and drew a new line, not inside the plan, around it. A perimeter, not for defense, for order. A boundary between what is and what is to come. Nam stood up and walked over. He looked at the map. He poked his finger at the drainage line and asked what it was. Si-hyuk explained. A sewer, to carry away dirty water. Nam looked at him as if he'd spoken in the language of the dead. Then he said that in 30 years he'd seen 200 settlements. Not a single one had a drainage system. People just poured everything out onto the street. Si-hyuk said that's why people get sick. Nam fell silent. Then he nodded. Slowly. Heavily. They talked until evening. Nam knew everything there was to know about the world outside. 4 principalities surround the desert. Haejin in the north, the most powerful, with an architect's guild that controls the breathing stones. Murek in the east, commercial and greedy. Sil in the south, poor and desperate. Tanra in the west, closed off and strange. Between them, caravan routes run along the edge of the desert through oases. Each oasis is a stop, water, trade, sometimes a fight. Nam told us that there are no doors in the desert. Metal melts, stone cracks, nothing survives on the glass plain. But this door stands, and behind it, water and walls. And a man drawing drainage channels. He said that either Si-hyuk is a saint or a madman. Si-hyuk replied that he's just an architect who wants a drink. Nam laughed. The first laugh in this world. Dry, short, like a cough, but a laugh. At night, Si-hyuk lay in the bedroom and thought, 6 people, 7 rooms. There's water, there's shelter, no food, no fuel. But Nam had come from the Ren Oasis, a 2-day trek. So there's a place where you can trade, and you can trade water. In a world where the desert devours the land and wells run dry, water from a spring that never runs dry isn't a resource. It's currency. He fell asleep with that thought. Si-hyuk met old Nam, a caravan driver, and 2 teenagers, a brother and sister, from the destroyed village. Nam told him about the 4 principalities and warned that rumors about the door were already spreading through the oases. Si-hyuk decided to use the water from the well as a trading currency. The morning of the 8th day brought the 8th room, walls of dark stone, 2 by 2 meters. In the center, a stone block at waist height, flat, grooves on the surface, thin, geometric, straight lines intersecting at right angles, a coordinate grid. A scale ruler carved along the edge of the stone, notches for securing it. Si-hyuk stood before this block, his hands trembling, not from hunger, from recognition. On the ground lay a drafting board, a drafting table, the tool with which he had spent 20 years of his life. The house had given him not a knife, not a weapon, a drafting table. He went out to join the others. It was warm in the kitchen. Old Nam had brought fire. From somewhere in the folds of his cloak, he pulled out a flint and dry tinder. The first fire in 8 days burned in the hearth. There was little smoke. The draft through the hole in the workshop wall was working. Not perfectly, but it was working. The wall between the workshop and the storeroom was heating up. It was getting warmer in the storeroom, where Mei-He was sleeping with the child. Andal was working, in another world, in another body, through a hole punched with a dull knife, but it was working. Nam cooked a stew from the dried roots he'd brought with him. It smelled bitter and earthy. Their first meal. They ate in silence, all 6 of them gathered around the hearth. The bitter liquid burned their mouths, but to Sai-hyuk it tasted better than anything he'd ever tasted, not in this life, nor in the last. After the meal, Nam looked at him and said the roots would last 2 days. After that, they'd need real food. He could make it to the Ren oasis, but he had nothing to offer in exchange. Si-hyuk nodded. He already knew the answer. Water. They had water. Nam raised an eyebrow. You can't carry water across the desert without containers. It'll evaporate. We need water bags, jugs. They don't have any of those. Si-hyuk looked at the clay pots in the storeroom, 3 pots with lids. He took one, examined it. The clay was dense, fired. The lid didn't seal completely, but it fit tightly. Wrap it in cloth. Seal the edges with clay paste. It'll make a makeshift jug. Not perfect, but it'll last 2 days. Nam looked at him, then at the pot, then at him again. Then he said he needed a second pot, one with water for the journey, one for trading, water from a well in the middle of the glass desert, water that doesn't exist. It's a commodity, the best commodity in 30 years. Sai-hyuk gave away 2 pots. He kept the third. Mei-He tore the hem of her dress, and they wrapped it around the pots. Sai-hyuk mixed the clay for sealing from dust on the floor. Rough, but it worked. Nam left at dawn on the 9th day, with 2 pots, with a promise to return in 4 days. Si-hyuk stood at the door and watched as the figure grew smaller on the white plain. Mei-He stood nearby with the child. The girl came out of the house and stood beside them, silently. She hadn't spoken at all, not a word in 2 days. The boy did the talking for both of them, a lot, fast, about everything. He'd scoured every room, found a crack in the workshop wall, found that the condenser worked better closer to the chimney, found that the water in the well was colder in the morning and warmer in the evening. He'd come and report on everything, loudly, in detail, waving his arms about. Sai-hyuk listened and thought this boy would make an excellent foreman, if he survived. The girl was different. She was silent but observant, of everything, of everyone, and especially of the blueprints. Si-hyuk noticed this on the 2nd day. She stood in front of the sewer plan and traced the lines with her finger. Not mindlessly. She was following the logic, the direction of the flow, the gradients. A 14-year-old girl from a dead village stood in front of the blueprint and read it. Si-hyuk didn't say anything to her. He just took note. Without Nam, the days dragged on. The 9th day, a new room. A long, narrow corridor connected the bedroom directly to the workshop. For the first time, it was possible to walk from one end of the house to the other without passing through the central room. A second route. In any building, there are at least 2 paths from point A to point B. A fire safety rule. A rule of common sense. The 10th day. A small room, 1 meter by 1 meter. A stone floor sloping towards the center. A drain in the center. A vent above it. A shower. If you pour water from above, it will run off and drain away, for now, using a bucket. But Sai-hyuk made a mental note. Someday there would be running water here. Day 11. An outdoor extension, a shelter with 3 walls and a stone floor. Open on one side, a veranda, a transitional space between the house and the desert, a buffer zone. He loved spaces like this. He included them in every project he designed. Mei-He was the first to appreciate the veranda. She carried the baby out and laid him on a rock in the shade. The child lay there, gazing at the sky. It was the first time out in the open air, though not in the sun. Mei-He sat down beside him, and Si-hyuk saw her shoulders relax. Not completely, just a little. But he noticed. He worked every day, from dawn till dusk. At the drafting table, he used a sharp shard of glass to scratch lines into the grid lines. A master plan for 50 rooms, the central axis, the well, the square, 2 residential wings, the service wing, the restroom area on the periphery, the kitchen dining room, the storage rooms. All routes were measured in steps. All drainage ran from the center to the edges. The house provided a drafting table with a coordinate grid. Nam left for the Ren Oasis with 2 pots of water to trade. In the 3 days he was gone, a corridor, a shower room, and a veranda appeared. Si-hyuk began drafting the master plan for the future settlement of 50 rooms. The girl came on the 3rd day, without Nam. She entered the drafting room in silence. She stood behind Si-hyuk's back, watching him work. He sensed her gaze but didn't turn around. She stood there for an hour, then she left. The next day, she came again. For 2 hours. On the 5th day, Si-hyuk placed a shard of glass and a piece of clay next to him on the stone surface. He didn't say a word, he just set them down. The girl stood there. She looked at the shard, at the clay, at him. Then she stepped forward. She picked them up. She walked over to the wall and began to draw. A curved line, a straight line, a square. Inside the square, another one smaller, a tiny circle in the corner. Si-hyuk looked. A square inside it, a circle, a room, a bed, a window. She had drawn a room. Her room, the one she'd never had. Something inside Si-hyuk tightened, not in his throat, deeper. A 14-year-old orphan had drawn the place where she wanted to live. He walked over to the wall. He took out his shard, and next to her sketch, he drew the same square, but with dimensions, with a door, with the window's orientation marked, with a note on the ceiling height. He turned her dream into a technical drawing. The girl watched, then she looked at him, and something appeared on her face, not a smile. A flicker, a shadow of what would one day become a smile. From that day on, she had a name. Yuna. She said it quietly when he asked. One word after 5 days of silence. Yuna. Si-hyuk nodded and wrote it next to the blueprint of her room. Yuna's room, with a window. He marked it on the master plan. In the north wing, where the morning sun is soft, but the evening sun isn't, where the wall will be warm from the chimney, where, if a window ever appears, it will look out not onto a desert, but onto a courtyard. He calculated all of this in a minute. 20 years of designing rooms for people who have nowhere else to go. 20 years of working with those who had lost everything. He knew where to place the bed so a person would fall asleep facing the door. He knew how high the ceiling should be so it wouldn't feel oppressive. He knew the window should be at the eye level of a seated person, not a standing one. Because a person who has just lost their home sits, for a long time, in silence, and stares. And what they see at that moment determines whether they'll stay or leave. Old Nam returned on the 12th day, late. The sun had already set, the desert had turned gray. He didn't come alone. A donkey followed him, a small, skinny, stubborn donkey carrying 2 sacks. Meishi ran out onto the porch. The boy shouted and ran to meet him. Yuna stayed by the door. Nam reached the porch. He set down the sacks. He sat down, exhausted. 4 days traveling back and forth across the glass. For a 50-year-old man, that's a feat. He didn't say that. He said he'd brought grain, dried meat, salt, rope, cloth, 2 real jugs with stoppers, and news. The water had an effect. The merchant at the Ren Oasis tasted it and fell silent. He tasted it again. He asked where it came from. Nam said from a well in the desert. The merchant didn't believe him. He offered us a second serving for free. The merchant drank it. He fell silent again. Then he gave us everything we asked for in exchange for the rest, and a donkey to boot for a pot of water. Si-hyuk wasn't surprised. The water from the well wasn't just water. It was pure, filtered by that greenish glow at the bottom. In a world where water from oases is often murky, brackish, and contaminated, this was a miracle. Not a magical one, a technological one. The ancient filtration system of the First Empire was still working 200 years later. But Nam didn't just bring goods, he brought a warning. At the Ren Oasis, 3 people in gray cloaks were standing. They weren't trading, they weren't buying. They sat in the shade and listened to every conversation. Nam recognized this type. Guild members, scouts from the Hejin Architects Guild. They search for traces of old architecture, any traces, and destroy them, along with those who found them. Si-hyuk listened and asked how much time they had. Nam shrugged. A week, maybe 2. The guild members take their time. They check, they double-check, but when they come with a decision. A week. He has 11 rooms, 6 people, including a baby and 2 teenagers. Up against an organization that destroys everything reminiscent of the First Empire. He stood up and walked over to the drafting table. He sat down. He placed his palms on the grid, cold stone, grooves, lines. He closed his eyes and saw the plan. Not the one on the wall, another one, a bigger one. How 11 would become 20, how 20 would become 50, how a wall would appear, a courtyard, a gate, not a fortress. A house, a large house you can enter and leave, but one you don't want to leave. He opened his eyes. He picked up a shard of glass and began to sketch. The master plan for the settlement of Munja, the threshold, the place between the desert and life. He drew until dawn. His hand guided the shard across the stone smoothly and confidently, as if it knew where to go before his mind had even decided. When the sun rose and the first ray fell on the table, Si-hyuk stepped back and looked. On the stone was a plan, a true master plan, a central square surrounding a well, 2 residential wings radiating out from the center, a service corridor along the perimeter, 2 gates, the eastern and western ones, a drainage line, a spot for the market, a spot for the school, a mark indicating where the library would be, wind direction arrows, markings for the sun's altitude at different times of day, a shaded area, a spot for a second well, and a small square in the north wing. Yuna's room, with a window. Over 200 rooms on this blueprint. He had 11, maybe 12 by morning, 12 out of 200. But the plan was ready, and every subsequent room would fit into it like a part in a mechanism, according to plan. He finished his water and stepped out onto the veranda. The morning of the 12th day, somewhere 2 days' journey away, 3 people in gray raincoats were asking questions, and he stood on a rock, thinking he'd forgotten to mark the spot for the communal laundry room. That thought was from a past life, his last project, the resettlement district, the laundry room on the first floor. He never did decide where to put it. He fell asleep at the wheel, crashed into a bridge pier, died, and the first thing he does in this new world is look for a place for the laundry room again. Si-hyuk smiled. Mei-hee brought him some grain porridge, thick, hot. He ate and looked out at the desert. Mei-hee sat down next to him. The child was sleeping in her arms. She was silent. Then she asked, quietly, simply, why was he doing this? Why was he drawing a city that didn't exist? Why was he planning 200 rooms when he only had 11? Why was he drawing a school when he didn't have a teacher? Si-hyuk thought for a moment. Then he answered. He said that in the land where he came from, he'd seen one thing hundreds of times. People build first and think later. They put up a house here because there's stone here. They put up a second one next to it because the first one is already standing there. 5 years later, you can't walk through, drive through, or run a pipe through. 10 years later, the children get sick because the sewage runs right past the well. 20 years later, they tear down the whole neighborhood and rebuild it. He said he didn't want to tear it down and rebuild it. He wanted to do it right the first time. Mei-hee listened. Then she said he was a strange man. Si-hyuk agreed. The morning of the 13th day, room 12. It appeared on the east side, long, narrow, 4 by 2 meters, with a low ceiling. Along one wall was a stone ledge, wide, at knee level. Si-hyuk entered and looked around. The ledge was smooth, too smooth for a ledge. He touched it, ran his hand over it. The stone was warm, not from the sun, from within. He pressed his ear against it. Silence. But warmth. A warm stone ledge running the entire length of the wall, he realized. A sleeping platform. A heated sleeping platform, like an ondol. A warm floor, only it wasn't a floor but a ledge. Somewhere beneath the stone or inside the wall, heat was flowing. From a hearth. Or from something else. He didn't know the source, but he knew the result. You could lie here and the stone beneath you would stay warm all night. He returned to the blueprint and made a correction. This room would be part of the living quarters for the family, for Mei and her son. The child needed warmth at night. This heated bench would provide it, without smoke, without fire, without risk. Mei moved into the new room that same day. She lay down on the warm stone with her child in her arms and didn't move for a long time. Then she said one word. Sai-hyuk took it as gratitude, or as something more than gratitude. He left and got to work. There was a lot to do. Nam showed him how to cook the grain. Simple porridge made with water, salt, nothing else. But the grain would last 6 people a week if they were frugal. Nam ordered the meat to be smoked. The workshop with the chimney became a smokehouse, just as Sai-hyuk had planned. Strips of meat were hung on a rope from the ceiling. The smoke from the hearth drifted through the hole in the wall, slow and lazy. After 2 days, the meat had darkened and hardened. Nam tasted it and said it could have been worse. It'll do for a first try. Si-hyuk put the salt away in the pantry in a clay pot with a lid. Salt in this world was more expensive than meat. Nam explained. Haejin controlled the salt veins in the north. In the south, the deposits had run dry 10 years ago. Salt meant power. Whoever controlled the salt controlled the food. Whoever controlled the food controlled the people. Si-hyuk listened and took it all in. On the evening of the 13th day, he sat on the veranda watching the sunset. The red sun was sinking below the horizon. The desert was changing colors: white, yellow, orange, red, black. Nam sat nearby, smoking something from a small pipe. The smell was Swedish and unfamiliar. Nam asked what Si-hyuk would do when the guild arrived. Si-hyuk remained silent. He'd been thinking about it ever since he heard the warning. The Haejin Architects Guild destroys everything that reminds them of the First Empire. His house is a remnant of the First Empire, so they'll come to destroy it. He can't fight. He has a knife, just one dull knife. There's nowhere to run. It's a desert. There's nowhere to hide. The house stands in the open. You can see it from kilometers away. There's only one option left: make it unprofitable for them to destroy the house. He turned to Nam and asked what the guild wanted most of all. Nam answered without hesitation. Control. Over the breathing stones, over the ancient architecture, over knowledge. They want to be the only ones who decide what can be built and what cannot. Sai-hyuk nodded. Then he asked what the guild feared most of all. Nam took a long drag. He exhaled smoke, repetition. The catastrophes of the seal. They're afraid that someone will repeat what the mage architects did 200 years ago. Build something too big, too alive, something that will spiral out of control. Si-hyuk looked at his house, 11 rooms that grew every night. Without his control, without his choice, he understood why the guild was afraid. He was afraid himself. But there's a difference between fear and destruction. Fear can be turned into caution. Destruction can't be turned into anything. He told Nam that when the guild members arrived, he would show them the blueprints. Everything. He wouldn't hide anything. Nam looked at him as if he were a madman. Si-hyuk explained, the guild fears the unknown, that which grows in secret, in the darkness. Without rules, if he showed them the plan with dimensions, with calculations, with a drainage and ventilation system, with a school and a library, they wouldn't see a threat, they'd see order, and the guild members understand order. Nam was silent for a long time. Then he said that this was either the smartest or the dumbest plan he'd ever heard. Si-hyuk replied that in architecture, those two are usually one and the same. Si-hyuk finalized the master plan for Munja, comprising 200 rooms, and moved Mei and her child into a new room with a heated bed. Nam set up a meat-smoking operation in the workshop and explained the value of salt in this world. Si Hyuk decided that when the guild members arrived, he would show them all the blueprints openly instead of hiding them. Day 14. Room 13. It puzzled Si Hyuk, a small room 1.5 by 1.5 meters with a single distinctive feature. At chest height, there was a recess in the wall, a niche, about the depth of a palm, perfectly smooth with a groove along its lower edge. He stood before this niche and thought, too small for storage, not in the right place for ventilation, no channels for anything technical. He ran his finger along the groove, thin, even, like a guide, like a slot for something meant to fit into it. He set the mystery aside for later and left. There were too many things to do to figure out every oddity in the house. The morning began with the boy's cry. He was standing on the porch, pointing toward the horizon. Dots. Lots of dots. Not 3 like last time. 10, maybe 15. They were moving slowly, erratically. A caravan, or what was left of a caravan. Nam went out and looked. He squinted. Then he said one word that Si Hyuk already knew. Refugees. They arrived around noon. 13 people, 5 women, 4 men, 4 children, from the village of Kalmo on the southern edge of the desert. The village had stood by the oasis for 40 years. A month ago, the desert had crept up to the wells. The water was gone within a week. Glass seeped through the soil like a disease through the skin. They left with whatever they could carry. They walked for 9 days. 2 didn't make it. Si Hyuk stood on the porch and watched them approach, exhausted, ashen. Children carried in the adults' arms. One man carried an old woman on his back. He counted. 13 plus 6, 19. He had 13 rooms. The total area was about 55 square meters. For 19 people, that's 3 square meters per person. 3 square meters, the standard for a refugee camp. He'd seen such camps in photographs at the Seoul office. 3.5 square meters per person. People sleeping in 3 shifts, children in their parents' arms. The elderly against the walls, and the smell, a smell that wouldn't go away. He had seen those photographs and thought he would never allow anything like that in his projects. Now he was standing before this reality, and he had nothing but 13 rooms and a plan on the wall. He sprang into action. Water, water first. The well. A line. One at a time. Slowly, little by little. Mei stood by the well and handed out water with her palms, calmly, steadily, as if she'd been doing this her whole life. She spoke to the people, quietly. She called them by the names she learned on the spot. She asked for the children's names. She remembered them. Si Hyuk watched her and realized that this woman was doing what no architect could do. She was creating order not with walls and doors, but with words and glances. Nam took charge of the men. He led them aside. He questioned them. He found out what each one could do. One was a mason, another was a shepherd, the third was a miller, the fourth knew nothing except how to fight. Nam took the 4th man out to the veranda and sat him down there. He didn't say anything to him. He just sat him down separately. Si Hyuk noticed this. He approached Nam and asked. Nam replied briefly, "This one will be a problem. Not now, later, when he's eaten his fill and feels his strength." Nam had seen many like him over the past 30 years. They arrive weak and grateful. Then they become strong and demanding. Si Hyuk nodded and took note. Then he went over to the drafting table. 3 square meters per person. Unacceptable, but temporary. Tomorrow, there will be a 14th room. The day after tomorrow, a 15th. In a week, a 20th. 1 more room every night. Each room adds 6 to 10 square meters. In 10 days, the total area will double. He needed to relocate the people so they could get through these 10 days without illness or conflict. He began redrawing the plans, quickly, confidently. The workshop smokehouse stays. Food is more important than space. The attic above the kitchen becomes the children's room. 4 new children, plus Mei's baby. Warm, safe, warm air from below. Mei will keep an eye on things. The bricklayer and the miller will sleep on the workshop floor. It's rough, but they're grown men. They'll manage. The shepherd goes to the porch. He's used to sleeping under the open sky. The awning will do for him. The fourth one, the brawler, goes to the porch too, next to the shepherd. Let the shepherd keep an eye on him. He agreed to it. Women and children inside, men outside or in the utility rooms, priority based on vulnerability. First, those who are weaker, then those who are stronger. This isn't nobility, it's calculation. If a child gets sick, the whole community will be thrown into turmoil. If an adult man gets sick, the community will survive. By evening, everyone had been assigned a place. 19 people in 13 rooms. It was cramped, but everyone had a place. Their own place, not just any corner, but a specific corner in a specific room with a specific neighbor. Si-hyuk spent 3 hours on this assignment. For 3 hours, he walked from room to room, deciding who would go where. The bricklayer with the miller because they're both quiet, the mother and her 2 daughters in the room next to Mei-hee because Mei-hee already knows their names, the old woman on the warm bed because she has a cough. All these decisions were invisible. None of the 19 knew that their assignment had taken 3 hours of calculations. To them, it seemed simple. They arrived. They were shown their place. They lay down. But behind that simplicity lay 20 years of experience, 20 years of designing housing for those who have nowhere else to go, 20 years of understanding that if you put a mother next to a stranger who is also a mother, they'll become allies within 2 days. That if you put 2 men who don't know each other in the same room without women or children nearby, one of them will try to take charge within a day. That an old man by a warm wall will live 2 weeks longer than an old man by a cold one. Little things, details, centimeters and degrees, life is made up of them. Or death. That night, Si-hyuk sat in the drafting room and looked at the blueprint. 200 rooms on paper, 13 in reality, 19 people, and somewhere 2 days' march away people in gray cloaks were eavesdropping on conversations. He picked up a shard of glass and added a new note to the blueprint: laundry room in the west wing next to the shower room, with a water supply from the well, with a 2% drain slope. He put a period and set the shard aside. Then he looked at his hands, someone else's hands, thinner, younger, with calluses he hadn't had in his past life, with fingernails worn down to the flesh from working with stone and glass. In 2 weeks, these hands had accomplished more than his real ones had in the last 2 years in Seoul. He clenched his fists, unclenched them, stood up, stepped out onto the veranda. The night was quiet. The stars were unfamiliar. Not a single constellation he recognized. A different sky, a different world, different hands, but the same man, the same architect who knew nothing but how to arrange space so that people would feel at ease. He sat down on a rock and, for the first time in 14 days, allowed himself to stop thinking. He just sat there and breathed. The air was cold and clear. At night, the desert smelled of glass and something distant, something he couldn't name. Maybe rain, maybe the sea, maybe the place he'd come from. Half an hour later, he stood up and went back inside. He lay down on the floor in the drafting room next to the table. The stone was hard. He'd given the warm bed to Mei-shi, the bedroom to the new women, the attic to the children. All that was left for him was the drafting room, a stone floor and a stone table. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow there would be a 14th room. Tomorrow he'd have to decide where to fit her in. Tomorrow the bricklayer would ask if there was any work. Tomorrow the brawler would wake up well-fed and start looking around. Tomorrow Yuna would come into the drafting room and stand behind him, watching. Tomorrow, always tomorrow. He fell asleep and dreamed of the Seoul office, a monitor, a blueprint of the resettlement district, a laundry room on the first floor, and outside the window, a white desert stretching to the horizon. Day 15, room 14. A spacious room, 3 by 4 meters, with 2 arches. One led to the central room with the well, the other led outside to the east side. A passageway. Si-hyuk stood there, turning slowly. 2 arches, 2 directions. This room was a crossroads, a hub, a point from which one could go inside the house or go outside. On his master plan, this was exactly where the future entrance hall was marked. The house had guessed it, or known it. A mason from the village of Kalmo came to see him that morning, a silent man in his 40s with strong hands and calm eyes. He asked if there was any work. Sai Haikok led him to the wall with the sewer plan. He showed it to him. He explained it, the slope, the drain, the sand filter. The mason listened without interrupting. Then he touched the wall. He ran his finger along the line. He asked what to use to lay the pipes. Sai Hyok replied that there were no pipes. There's stone we can chisel. There's glass from the desert. There's clay. The mason nodded. He said they could build a trough out of the chiseled stone, not a pipe, a trough. Open at the top, covered with flat stones, sealed with clay. Not ideal, but it would do for now. Si Hyuk looked at him, then at the plan, then back at him, and for the first time in 15 days he felt something new, relief. He wasn't alone. He had someone whose hands knew how to lay stone. The mason's name was Dong-sul. He started working that very day. He went outside. He found a scattering of stones at the base of the house, debris that the house seemed to push out of itself at night. He began chipping away at them with a dull knife and a piece of glass, slowly, methodically. By evening, he had 8 stones roughly hewn into a semicircle, blanks for the gutter. Si Hyuk watched his work and made adjustments to the plan, not on the wall, on the drafting table. The gutter would run from the outhouse along the east wall. A 2% slope, an inspection stone every 10 steps, a sand filter at the outlet, a settling tank beyond the filter, beyond the settling tank, a drain into the desert. Far from the well, far from the entrance, on the leeward side. The 16th day, the 15th room, it appeared above the gatehouse, 2nd floor, small, 2 by 3 meters, with a narrow slit in the outer wall, not a window, a loophole. Si Hyuk stood before this slit and looked out at the desert. Through the loophole, he could see the horizon to the east, the very east from which the refugees had come, the very east where the Ren oasis lay, and somewhere beyond it, Heijin. The house had given him an observation post or a sentry post, or both. He wasn't building a fortress, but the house had other ideas. The brawler sprang into action on the 16th day, just as Nam had predicted. His name was Gae-moon, broad-shouldered, muscular, with quick eyes that were always darting about. He woke up well-fed after 3 days of food and water, and the first thing he did was walk around the entire house, slowly, carefully, peering into every room, counting the people, counting the exits, counting the supplies. Si Hyuk watched this from the veranda. He knew this type, not from the desert, from Seoul, from the immigrant neighborhoods. A man who enters a new place and, first and foremost, assesses who's in charge and how to unseat him. Not out of malice. Out of habit. Gae-moon came to him after his rounds. He stood across from him, folded his arms, asked who was in charge here. Si Hyuk replied that everyone was in charge. Gae-moon smirked. He said that didn't work that way. Someone is always in charge. Someone hands out water. Someone hands out food. Someone tells people where to sleep. That someone is the leader, and that someone is him. Si Hyuk. Si Hyuk looked at him, calmly, without defiance, without fear. And he said something Ga-moon didn't expect. He said that Ga-moon was right. Someone makes the decisions, and that someone really is him. But not because he's stronger, not because he's the first, but because he's the only one who can read the blueprint on the wall. And if Gae-moon wants to make decisions in his place, then let him first understand why the drainage slope needs to be 2% and not 3%. Gae-moon looked at the wall with the blueprints, then at Si Hyuk, then he walked away, without saying a word. Nam approached Si Hyuk and said this wasn't the end. Si Hyuk nodded. He knew. The 17th day, the 18th, the 19th. The rooms kept expanding. The 16th turned out to be a storage room with stone shelves. The 17th was yet another bedroom with a warm daybed. The 18th was a long corridor that closed the first loop of the house. For the first time, it was possible to walk all the way around the first floor in a circle without going outside, a closed route, a ring. In architecture, this is called circulation, the building's circulatory system. Sai-hyuk stood in that corridor and felt the house breathing. Not metaphorically, the air was moving, from the well, through the arches, down the corridor, to the ventilation openings, and back again. A faint, steady flow. The house had created lungs for itself. Don Sul was finishing the first section of the gutter, 10 paces of stone drainage from the outhouse along the east wall. Rough but functional. The water was draining away. It didn't stagnate. The miller joined them on the third day. He didn't know how to lay stone, but he knew how to mix clay. His hands were strong and patient. He sealed the joints between the gutter stones so tightly that no water seeped through. Si-hyuk gave them blueprints. Simple, clear. A line, a slope, dimensions. They looked at his blueprints as if they were messages from heaven, not because the blueprints were complicated, but because in this world no one ever drew plans before building. Here they built by eye, stone by stone, wall by wall, however it turned out. But Si-hyuk gave them paper, no, stone. Stone with lines that told you what to do before you even started. It was real magic, not a house, not a well, not a door, a drawing, a plan, a thought recorded in lines before it became stone. On the 20th day, Si-hyuk woke up and realized that something had changed, not in the house. The house had grown as usual, the 19th room, a small alcove next to the kitchen. What had changed was on the outside. He stepped out onto the veranda and saw them. Figures stood on the horizon. Not refugees. Refugees stagger. These stood upright, motionless. 3 figures, in gray cloaks. Bricklayer Don Sul began building the first section of the sewer system according to Sai-hyuk's blueprints. Gaemun had challenged him for power, and Sai-hyuk had responded through competence rather than force. The house closed its first circulation loop and began to breathe. On the 20th day, 3 guild scouts in gray cloaks appeared on the horizon. The 3 figures stood motionless. They stood on the horizon like pillars stuck in glass. They watched. Sai-hyuk stood on the veranda and watched back. Nam came out and stood beside him, in silence. Then he said they wouldn't approach today. The guild members observe first, 1 day, 2, sometimes 3. They count the people. They count the exits. They measure the size of the building. Then they come. Si-hyuk nodded. He went back inside. He gathered everyone in the central room by the well. 19 people, 4 children in their mother's arms, an old woman by the wall, Yuna by the door, her brother, a boy, crouching, Mei-hee with a child, Nam, Dong-sul, the miller, the shepherd, Gaemun in the far corner with his arms crossed. Si-hyuk explained, briefly, without fear, without panic, 3 people outside, the Heijin Architects Guild. They're looking for traces of old architecture and destroying them. This house is a trace of old architecture. So they've come for him. Silence. Then a commotion. Everyone spoke at once. One of the women grabbed the child and held it close. The miller turned pale. Gaemun leaned forward, his eyes sharpening. He said, "We need weapons, stones, sticks, anything. Strike first, at night, while they're sleeping on the glass." Nam shook his head. He said the guild members don't sleep on the glass. They're prepared, armed. They have devices that shatter stone from a distance. Attacking 3 guild members is suicide. Gaemun spat and said that in that case, they had to run, at night, in the dark. Scatter across the desert. Nam shook his head again. With the children and the old woman across the glass desert at night. 3 days to the nearest shelter. Half of us won't make it. Si-hyuk listened and waited. When the voices died down, he laid out his plan. He would show them everything, the blueprints, the rooms, the well, the drainage system, the settlement plan, everything, out in the open. Gaemun looked at him with an expression as if he'd suggested stripping naked in front of wolves. Mei-hee asked why. Quietly, calmly as always, Si-hyuk explained. The guild fears a repeat of the catastrophe. They fear what's growing in secret, in the dark, out of control. If he showed them the plan with the calculations and the system, they would see not chaos, but order, not a threat, but a tool. Architects understand blueprints, even hostile architects. Nam grunted. He said this was for if they wanted to look before they destroyed it. Si Hyuk replied that this was their only chance, and there was no other. 2 days were spent on preparation. Si Hyuk worked non-stop. He transferred all the blueprints from the walls to a stone table. He compiled them into a single plan. Clean, legible, with explanations, the Munja master plan, the water supply system, the sewage system, residential zones, utility zone, ventilation, orientation by cardinal directions. Everything he had drawn over the past 20 days lay on the stone like an open book. Yuna helped, silently. She would come into the drafting room and stand nearby. She'd hand him shards of glass when he reached out. She'd erase botched lines with a piece of clay. Once, she pointed to the junction between the residential wing and the service area. Si Hyuk looked. She was right. The 2 corridors intersected at an awkward angle. A bottleneck. He corrected it. He looked at her. Yuna was looking at the drawing, not at him. At the drawing. Day 22. Morning. They arrived. 3 figures stepped into the shadow of the veranda and stopped. Floor-length gray raincoats, hoods thrown back. 2 men and a woman. The eldest was tall, lean, with a long face and eyes that never blinked. The second man was stocky and silent. The woman stood slightly behind them. Young, about 25, with short hair and a scar on her left arm. She wasn't looking at Si Hyuk. She was looking at the walls, at the arches, at the joints between the rooms. Her eyes moved in a way Si Hyuk recognized. She was reading the building. Just like him, the eldest spoke. His voice was even, without threat, without warmth. He introduced himself. Inspector Kang Tae-wook, Haejin Architects Guild, 3rd rank, authorized to inspect and evaluate. He said they had received reports of unregistered architectural activity in the glass desert zone. He said he was obligated to conduct an inspection. He asked who was in charge of the construction here. Si Hyuk stepped forward and said it was him. The inspector looked at him for a long time, appraisingly. Then he asked for his name and rank in the guild. Si Hyuk said he had no rank. He was not a member of the guild. The inspector was silent for a moment. Then he said that construction without a guild license was a violation of the Haejin Code. The penalty ranged from a fine to demolition of the structure and expulsion of the builder. Si Hyuk replied that he had already been expelled. What else could they do to him? The inspector didn't smile, but something in his eyes had changed. Si Hyuk invited them inside. The inspector nodded, and they entered. He led them through the house. Slowly, room by room, the well, the kitchen, the pantry, the bedrooms, the workshop and smokehouse, the bathroom, the shower room, the hallways, the attic, the veranda. At each stop, he explained. He wasn't making excuses. He was explaining, like a professional to a professional. Here's the well, the water source, an ancient filtration system. It operates autonomously. Here's the kitchen, the hearth, the chimney, draft through an opening in the workshop wall, ondol, heating the adjacent wall by circulating hot air. Here's the bathroom, a sand filter, a drainage channel, a 2% slope. Here's a stone gutter, the first section of the sewer system, 10 steps. It's working. The inspector remained silent. He walked, he looked, he touched the walls. The stocky man was silent, too. The woman in the gray coat walked last, and her eyes didn't linger for a single second. She saw everything, every joint, every arch, every corner. Si Hyuk led them to the drafting room. He pointed to the table. He pointed to the plan, the master plan of Munja for 200 rooms. The inspector leaned over the stone. He looked at it for a long time. Then he straightened up. And for the first time during the entire inspection, he asked a question that wasn't just a formality. He asked how Si Hyuk knew about the cross-drainage system. Si Hyuk didn't understand. The inspector pointed to the drainage line on the plain. He said that the cross-drainage system with inspection wells had been lost along with the First Empire. Not a single architect in the guild knows how to calculate it. They know it existed. They've seen fragments in the ruins, but the calculation method was lost 200 years ago, and here on this stone it's inscribed, with the correct slope, with the correct intervals, with the correct placement of the filters. Si-hyuk was silent for 3 seconds. Then he told the truth. He said he knew nothing about any cross-drainage system from the First Empire. He knew the ordinary sewer system, from the surface, from another world, where this system was reinvented 3,000 years ago and has been used in every city ever since. The inspector looked at him, silently, for a long time. The woman in the gray coat stood by the wall and watched as well, and Si-hyuk saw in her eyes not hostility, hunger. The hunger of a person who had spent their whole life searching for knowledge and suddenly saw it inscribed on stone. The inspector straightened up. He said he needed time. He left. The stocky man followed him. The woman lingered for a second. She looked at the blueprint, then at Si-hyuk. Then she left. They set up camp 100 paces from the house, 3 gray cloaks against the white glass. Nam approached Si-hyuk and asked what to do now. Si-hyuk replied that now they had to wait. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the drafting room and stared at the blueprint. 20 rooms, 19 people, 3 guild members outside, and a plan that would either save them all or destroy them. The inspector returned in the morning, alone, without the stocky man, without the woman. He stood by the door and waited. Si-hyuk came out. They stood facing each other on the porch. The inspector was silent. Then he spoke, as slowly, heavily, like a man who had made a decision but didn't yet know if it was the right one. He said that, according to the Haejon Code, he was obligated to report unregistered construction activity in the desert zone. He was obligated to recommend demolition. He was obligated to bring the builder to Haejon for a guild trial. He said he would not do any of that. Si-hyuk remained silent. The inspector continued. He said that in 20 years of service he had seen hundreds of structures, shacks, huts, barns, palaces, fortresses. Not a single one had a drainage system. Not a single one had a ventilation plan. Not a single one was designed before construction began. He said that what he saw on the stone table was not heresy. It was what the guild should have been doing for the past 200 years instead of hunting for debris. Then he fell silent. For a long time, and Si-hyuk realized that the inspector was waiting, not for an answer, for a suggestion. Si-hyuk made a suggestion. Simply, directly. He said the inspector could stay. For 1 day, for 2, for a week, as long as he wanted. He could look at the blueprints. He could ask questions. He could copy whatever he wanted. In return, Si-hyuk asked for one thing. Time. A month? 2. Without guild officials at the doorstep, without the threat of demolition. Time for the house to grow, and for the people inside it to get back on their feet. The inspector thought for a minute. Then he nodded. Then he said his report to Haejon would be sent in 6 weeks. He would write that he had discovered ruins of no interest. That would give Si-hyuk 6 weeks until the next inspection. Maybe more. The guild moves slowly. Bureaucracy? He didn't smile, but there was something in his voice that sounded like weary relief. The inspector spent 3 days in the house. He sat in the drafting room for hours. He looked at the blueprint. He asked questions, not like an inspector, but like an architect. Why did the drainage run from the center to the edges? Why were the bedrooms oriented away from the sun? Why was there a buffer zone between the house and the desert? Si-hyuk answered, as a colleague, as an equal. 2 architects poring over a single drawing, from different worlds, with different tools, but speaking the same language. Lines on stone speak the same language everywhere. A woman from the group appeared on the 2nd day. She walked into the drafting room when the inspector had gone on a site tour. She stood by the table. She looked at it for a long time. Then she raised her head and looked at Si-hyuk. And she said her name was Lee So-yeon. that she was a fourth-rank apprentice, that she was forbidden from drawing in the guild, because she was a woman. Women were allowed to transcribe other people's drawings, to copy them, to archive them, but not to create them. She said this in an even voice, without complaint, without anger. As a matter of fact, like the temperature of the air. Then she looked at the plan and said that the junction between the residential wing and the service area needed to be softened. The angle was too sharp. People will cut across the yard and trample a path past the drainage gutter. Si-hyuk looked at the plan. She was right. He raised his head and looked at her. Then, silently, he picked up the second shard of glass. He placed it on the stone in front of her. He said one sentence. "It's your part." He didn't interfere. So-yeon stood motionless. She stared at the shard of glass. Then she looked up. Something glinted in her eyes. She picked up the shard, leaned over the stone, and began to draw. The lines flowed quickly, confidently, firmly. She drew as if she'd been waiting for this her whole life. She worked for 3 hours without looking up. When she finished, Si-hyuk approached and looked. The joint had been redrawn, not just softened, redesigned. So-yeon had added an intermediate courtyard, a small one, triangular, with a stone bench and a patch of shade, a transitional space between the living area and the utility area, a buffer, like a veranda, but an interior one. Si-hyuk looked at her work and felt something inside him fall into place. Not a detail of the plan, something bigger. He'd been drawing alone for 20 days. Now he had Yuna, who saw the mistakes. Don-sul, who knew how to lay stone. Mei-hee, who remembered names. Nam, who knew the roads. And now So-yeon, who drew so well that he had nothing to correct. The inspector left on the 3rd day. He took the stocky man with him. He headed west toward the nearest caravan. So-yeon stayed. She didn't ask. She didn't explain. She simply took off her gray cloak, folded it, and placed it on a stone shelf in the drafting room. The inspector looked at her, then at Si-hyuk. Then he nodded and left, without looking back. So-yeon stood by the table and looked at the blueprint. Si-hyuk asked where she would sleep. So-yeon replied that she'd sleep on the floor, wherever they told her to. Si-hyuk shook his head. He left. He returned 10 minutes later with a piece of fabric. He hung it in the corner of the drafting room, partitioning off a small space. He placed the coat she'd folded on the floor. He said it was temporary. In a week, 3 or 4 more rooms would be ready. One of them would be hers. So-yeon looked at the alcove, at the raincoat on the floor, at the piece of fabric serving as a wall. Then she turned away. Quickly, but Si-hyuk had already seen it. She pressed her lips together, not out of anger, because she wasn't used to it. She wasn't used to being given a place to stay, not a copy desk in the guild's basement. A place. 6 weeks. 42 days, 42 new rooms. Counting from the first day, that made 62 rooms by the end of the 2nd month. The population had grown to 53 people. They arrived in groups of 2, 3, or 7 from different parts of the desert. Rumors of the door had spread throughout all 4 principalities. Nam went to the Ren oasis every 10 days. He carried away water. He brought back grain, meat, cloth, and tools. On his 4th trip, he brought a blacksmith with him, an old, lame blacksmith with one good eye and hands that could bend an iron rod with his bare fingers. The blacksmith looked at the workshop smokehouse, then at the hearth, then at Si-hyuk, and said he needed a forge, a separate one, with a furnace, with an anvil, with a ventilation hood. Si-hyuk showed him the plan. The forge was marked on the southwestern edge of the utility zone, farther away from the residential areas, because of the noise, because of the heat, because of the sparks. The blacksmith looked at the plan and said that for the first time in his life, he'd seen someone think about where to put a smithy before it was even needed. Si-hyuk replied that he always thought ahead. That was his job. So-yeon worked every day. She drew faster than Si-hyuk, more decisively, with more confidence. Her lines were like commands, straight, without hesitation. They argued over the blueprints every evening, loudly, sharply. She said his living quarters were too big. 3 by 3 was a luxury, 2.5 by 2.5 was enough. He said that a half-meter difference wasn't a luxury, but a matter of dignity. A person in a 2.5 by 2.5 room can't turn around without bumping into a wall. She said that if they made them 3 by 3, they'd end up with 150 rooms in a year instead of 200, and 50 people would be left without a roof over their heads. He said that 50 people in poor quality rooms were worse than 30 in good ones because, after a year, people would leave the poor quality rooms but stay in the good ones. They argued for an hour, 2, 3. Mehi brought them water and silently set it on the table between the blueprints. So-yeon didn't notice. Si-hyuk did, every time. 2 cups, always 2 cups. At some point, he stopped thinking of it as a coincidence. Gaemun created a problem on the 45th day, just as Nam had predicted. Not right away, gradually. At first, he started helping out. He carried stones for Dong-sul. He hauled water. He worked silently and quickly. Then he began to organize. Other men, 4 of them, then 6. They listened to him, not to Si-hyuk. To him, because Si-hyuk drew the plans and Gaemun carried them out. Si-hyuk stood on the roof, watching and telling them where to place things. Gaemun stood below, directing the men and the stones. There was a line between them, a thin one, an invisible one. A line that separated the plan from its execution, the architect from the foreman. Si-hyuk knew that this line was dangerous. A foreman who manages people every day is stronger than an architect who draws plans on the roof. He knew this from Seoul. He knew it from construction sites. He knew it from life. On the 45th day, Gaemun came to him and said that the men were unhappy. They worked all day but slept on the floor. The women slept on cots while the men slept on stone. It was unfair. He didn't threaten him. He didn't yell. He spoke calmly, almost reasonable. And that was the most dangerous part. Si-hyuk looked at him. Then he stood up and led him to the blueprint. He pointed it out. The next 8 rooms that would be completed within the coming week. 4 of them were designated as living quarters. 2 for families, 2 for single men, with cots, with ventilation, with a storage niche. He pointed it out and said that in a week every man would have a place, not a corner. A place, but that would take 7 days and 7 nights for the building to grow into what was needed. Gaemun listened. He looked at the blueprint. He didn't know how to read it, but he saw the squares. He saw the markings. He could see that Si-hyuk wasn't lying. The plan had existed before his complaint. The space for the men had been marked off before the men started complaining. Gaemun left. A week later, the men got their rooms. Gaemun got his. He walked in and saw a cot, a storage niche, a ventilation vent, a small shelf for belongings. Small, simple, but it was his. He sat down on the cot and sat there motionless for a long time. Then he went out and found Si-hyuk. He asked why there was a shelf. Si-hyuk replied that everyone has things they don't want to put on the floor. Gaemun looked at him for a long time, then he nodded and left. He didn't become a different person. He didn't become an ally, but he ceased to be a threat because Si-hyuk did for him the same thing he did for everyone else. He gave him a place, not a room, a place. His own place where he was seen as a person and not as a problem. On the 55th day, Nam returned with news, bad news. The Principality of Murak in the east had noticed the trade routes leading to Munja. It had noticed that caravan drivers were making a detour through the desert for water. It had noticed that water from Munja was being sold at 3 oases. Murak sent a trade representative, an official one with a letter, a seal, and an offer that was, in fact, an ultimatum. Become Murak's trading vassal. Pay taxes in water, 20% of every pot. In return, Murak promised protection and access to trade routes. He told us that refusal would mean a blockade. Si-hyuk listened. Then he sat down at the drafting table and stared at the plan for a long time. The courtyard, the well, the residential wings, the service area, 2 streets, 62 rooms, 53 people, a blacksmith, a mason, a miller, a caravan driver, 24 workers, a smithy that would start making tools in a week, a smokehouse, warehouses with a month's supply of grain. He turned to Nam and asked how long he had to give an answer. Nam said that Murak's representative was waiting at the Ren oasis, 10 days. Sahyok nodded. Then he looked at So-yeon. She was standing by the table with her arms crossed. He asked for her opinion. She answered without hesitation. She said that vassalage meant death, not immediately. In a year, in 2 years. Murak will take the water. Then the people. Then the home. She'd seen it in Heijin. The guild started with taxes. It ended with control. Sahyok nodded. Then he looked at Mei-hee. She was standing in the doorway with a child. Silently. She didn't talk about politics. She talked about people. She said that if Murak cut off the caravans, the children would be the first to go hungry. Sahyok nodded again. 3 opinions, 1 decision. He refuses, but not through Nam. Personally. He'll go to the Ren oasis himself. Nam said it was madness. 2 days on the glass road, 1 way. Sahyok replied that in 10 days the house would have 10 rooms. So-yeon would handle the plan. Mei-hee would handle the people. Nam would handle the logistics. He needed to see the oasis, to see the merchant, to see Murak's representative. You can't design a city without knowing what's around it. It's like drawing a facade without seeing the street. Nam looked at him, then he shook his head, then he said he'd go with him. They set out at dawn on the 57th day. With water, with dried meat, with a donkey carrying 4 pots of water to the market. Sahyok looked back once. So-yeon and Yuna were standing on the veranda. So-yeon stood with her arms crossed. Yuna held a shard of glass in her hand. Mei-hee was nowhere to be seen. She was inside, doing what she did every day, making sure everyone had enough water and that everyone knew their own name. In 6 weeks, the house had grown to 62 rooms and 53 residents. So-yeon became a full-fledged architect of Munji. Gaemun got his own room and was no longer a threat. The Principality of Murak issued an ultimatum regarding vassalage, and Sahyok and Nam went out to the Ren oasis for face-to-face negotiations. The Ren oasis turned out to be smaller than Sahyok had imagined. 3 wells, a dozen mud brick shelters, 2 inns, a marketplace the size of his living room. Everything was dirty, everything was crooked. The walls were built haphazardly. Drainage ran straight onto the trail. Flies, the stench. He stood at the edge of the oasis, looking at it all, and thought that whoever designed this place deserved a special circle of hell, if hell even existed here. Nam led him to an inn, a low shed, fabric walls, a dirt floor. A representative of Muraka sat at a wooden table. Young, around 30, clean, well-groomed, with rings on his fingers and a seal around his neck. He looked at Sahyok, at his torn clothes, at his worn-down nails, at the gaunt face on that foreign body, and he smiled, indulgent, like an adult looking at a child who'd come to haggle. They talked for an hour. The representative repeated the offer. Vassalage, 20% of the water, protection of Murak, access to the eastern trade routes. Sahyok listened, then he replied. He didn't refuse outright. He did something else. He took a piece of clay out of his bag on which a map had been drawn, not the general map of Munji, another one, a trade route map. He'd drawn it 2 days before setting out. The map showed a new route not through Murak but through the south, through the Principality of Sil, through 3 oases that Nam knew like the back of his hand. The route took an extra day, but it bypassed all of Murak's lands entirely. Sahyok placed the map on the table and turned it toward the representative. He said that Munja was ready to trade with Murak, ready to sell water, ready to buy goods, but not as a vassal, as an equal partner. And if Murak blocked the caravans, Munja would go through the south, through Sil. And then Murak would lose not 20% of its water, it would lose the entire trade flow that already passes through Munja. The representative stopped smiling. He looked at the map, then at Sahyok, then back at the map. He didn't know how to read maps, But he knew how to read numbers, and the numbers on the map spoke clearly: distances, days of travel, and the amount of water at each crossing. Everything had been calculated. The representative took the plan and said he would forward it to Murak. An answer would come in a month. Si-hyuk nodded. He stood up. He left. On the way back, Nam remained silent for half a day. Then he said that in 30 years he had seen many negotiations. Not a single one had been won with a piece of clay marked with lines. Si-hyuk replied that the lines on the clay were also a weapon, just a different kind. They returned on the 59th day. During their 2-day absence, the house had grown by 2 rooms. So-yeon had incorporated both into the plan, perfectly, as if they had been conceived there all along. Si-hyuk looked at her work and said nothing. There was no need to say anything. She had done it. Time passed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The rooms grew. People came. Si-hyuk drew. So-yeon drew beside him. Yuna stood behind them and studied every line. Mei-hee remembered every name. Nam walked the roads and returned with goods and news. Dong-sul laid stone. The blacksmith forged tools. The miller ground grain on stone millstones that had appeared in one of the rooms on the 70th day. Gaemun organized the men and built walls around the courtyard, not because he was asked to, because there was a wall on the blueprint and he decided he would build it himself. Murak sent a reply 3 weeks later, not an ultimatum, a trade agreement, on equal terms, no vassalage, 5% of trade turnover. Nam read the terms aloud and whistled. He said that Murak had never offered such terms to a settlement less than a year old. Si-hyuk signed it. Not him personally. Together. He, Mei-hee, Nam. So-yeon, 4 signatures. 4 people. Not a ruler. A council. 3 months later, Munja became a real place. Not a house, not a camp. A place, with a street, with a courtyard, with a well in the center, with a blacksmith shop to the southwest, with a smokehouse, with warehouses, with the first school, a single room where the former priestess Hana taught 7 children the alphabet. Hana arrived on the 80th day. Quiet, gentle, with an iron will inside. She lost her faith when her fellow priests refused to let the refugees into the temple. She left and walked until she reached the door. Si-hyuk didn't suggest she build a temple. He suggested a library, a place where people come to ask questions, not to receive answers. Hina agreed, and for the first time in years, she fell asleep without nightmares. On the 100th day, Si-hyuk woke up and sensed that something had changed. He got up and walked through the house. 99 rooms. The 100th was supposed to have appeared overnight. He found it in the east wing, and he stopped in the doorway. The room was different, not made of clay, not made of stone. The walls were made of a material he'd never seen before. Smooth, warm to the touch, with a barely noticeable greenish glow, the same glow found at the bottom of a well. The floor was as smooth as glass, but not glass. The ceiling was high, higher than in any other room, and there was a hum in the walls, quiet, barely audible, as if the room were breathing. Not the way the house breathed through its ventilation system, but differently, like a living being. Si-hyuk stood in the doorway and looked. The 100th room, too perfect, made of materials he hadn't ordered. He stepped inside. He ran his hand along the wall. The wall was warm, alive. Under his fingers he felt a pulse, not his own. The house. The house was pulsing, and in the center of the room on the floor was a line. Thin, glowing, green, it ran from wall to wall, and Si-hyuk saw that it wasn't just a line. It was a drawing, part of a drawing, a fragment of a plan that someone had sketched here 200 years ago, or that the house itself had drawn. He dropped to his knees and looked closer. The lines formed a contour, the contour of a building, a large building, with 1,000 rooms. The house was revealing its final form to him, and Si-hyuk understood. The house wasn't just growing. The house was being built. Toward something, toward the 1,000th room. toward the moment when it would become what it was conceived to be 200 years ago, a living city, the very project that destroyed the First Empire. He sat on the floor of the 100th room and looked at the glowing blueprint. And he thought, not about fear, not about disaster, about the layout. Those magician architects 200 years ago had tried to build a living city, and everything fell apart. Why? He didn't know why. But he knew one thing: they were building a city for the sake of the city, a building for the sake of a building, structure for structure's sake. He'd seen it on Earth 1,000 times, an architect who falls in love with his own building and forgets that people will live inside it. A tower that's beautiful on the outside and unbearable on the inside. A stadium that's perfect in form and dreadful as a place. They built a living city, but they forgot to ask for whom it lives. Sai-hyuk stood up. He walked out of room 100. He walked down the hallway, past the kitchen where the smell of grain porridge lingered, past the pantry where Mei-hee was arranging pots on the shelves, past the courtyard where Gae-moon and Dong-sul were laying a wall, past the school from which came the sound of Hana reading to the children, past the drafting room where So-hyun was bent over the table and her lines fell onto the stone like commands, past the corner where Yuna sat on the floor with a shard of glass sketching a floor plan of a room, her room, with a window. He walked through the entire house and stepped out onto the veranda. He stood on a stone. He looked out at the desert, white, endless, dead, but not quite. On the horizon, far away, at the very edge, something was turning green, barely noticeable, like a shadow, like a promise. Where a month ago there had been dead glass, something alive was breaking through. Grass, or moss, or something for which there is no name in this world. The desert was receding, by a millimeter, by a centimeter, but it was receding. He looked at it and understood. The house wasn't being built for a catastrophe. The house was being built so that the catastrophe would end. 1,000 rooms isn't a bomb, it's a cure. But only if each of the 1,000 is built for a specific person, not for the city, not for an empire, not for glory. For Mei-hee, who needs a warm wall for her child. For Yuna, who needs a window. For So-yeon, who needs a table where she's allowed to draw. For Hana, who needs a library instead of a temple. For Gae-moon, who needs a shelf for the things he doesn't want to put on the floor. The door chose him, not because he's a genius, not because he's a time traveler, because his last project before his death wasn't a tower, not a museum, not a villa, but a resettlement neighborhood for people who have nowhere else to go. The door recognized its own from the blueprint. Si-hyuk sat down on a stone on the veranda. He wrapped his arms around his knees. The morning sun was warm and gentle. Sounds drifted out from the house. Voices, footsteps, the clatter of stone against stone, children's laughter from the school, the clanging of tools from the blacksmith's shop, the quiet scrape of glass against stone from the drafting room, the sounds of a living place. He sat and listened. For the first time in 100 days in this world, and in 29 years in the past, he wasn't thinking about what needed to be done. He wasn't counting square meters. He wasn't mapping out routes. He wasn't deciding where to put the laundry room. He just sat and listened. Then he stood up. He wiped his hands on his pants, the only pair of pants he had left that were still in one piece. He turned toward the door and said aloud, quietly, so that only he himself and perhaps the house could hear, "All right then, so we'll keep working." He walked inside, to the drafting table, to the coordinate grid, to the grooves in the stone, to the shard of glass serving as a pencil. Ahead of him lay 900 rooms, 900 blueprints, 900 decisions on where to place a bed so that a person would wake up in the morning and feel just a little better. His hand rested on the stone. The shard touched a groove. The first line of the 101st room was drawn smoothly and confidently, just like all the lines before it, just like all the lines after it.